this week's Mandala, everyone. Today, 14th of November, 2024. I hope you are all doing extremely very well.
I think this has been the quickest and the slowest year of my life at the same time.
That's an interesting thought. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got like 15-something episodes of this show so far.
Yeah.
We started in around April or something, I think.
Nice.
No, it's very, very interesting.
Yeah, it's probably up to like 100 albums or so now, eh?
Yeah, given it's 10 per show, I would assume so. That's brilliant. Hopefully one day someone makes an RYM list of all of these and I can be like, yeah, we've really made it. Because, I mean, it's a better show than Stephen Wilson's silly show. So, like, I mean, whatever. I'm just being bitter right now. We should be better instead of bitter. But that's not that difficult when Stephen Wilson's show is concerned. I'm kidding.
Better being bitter.
That's a good point. I like to think we can be both.
And the freshest cold thirst is Vic.
Ah, fascinating. But no, what today I would like to be discussing is series of albums. I actually had a little theme of the 5 I picked. They're from the 2000s. And unknowingly, you actually gave into this theme, at least for your first pick, because this is from 2009, I believe.
Yeah, and a few stylistic similarities as well with a couple of the picks I
You know what? With at least two of them off the top of my head.
Yeah,
right.
two of them mostly, yeah. But my first one is most similar to, say, your last pick, I felt.
Yes.
My first one is Toe for Long Tomorrow.
Yeah, Toa from Japan.
Yeah, speaking of just before the show, we we're talking about the technically minded Japanese musicians. And
yes, very disciplined.
This is a good example of that, I think. Just to quickly lay down, I guess, the sort of stylings. What would you say? It's sort of math rocky album.
Classier prog metal.
Yeah, a little bit.
I guess that's what math rock is.
Yeah, that is what math rock is. It's like a clean prog metal to some degree. Yeah, it's a bit post rocky too. As it goes on, it's sort of. I think the thing I like about this album is its variety, the variety of its sound palette as well. Like it goes through quite a few different things. Like it starts off as a sort of the more acoustic ends of math rock or post rock, where it's sort of plucking along intricate riffs on guitars and maybe 3 guitars going at once in the mix and things like that. And then it'll mix in, as it goes on, it gets a bit more similar to your last pick as well. It goes more into jazz fusion-y territory even. Sort of soloing with sort of overdriven or lightly distorted guitars, And I think the key to this album, and I think this album sort of illustrates, at least in my mind, what because I'm not the biggest fan of math rock, but I think a good math rock band they always have amazing drummers, and I think that the drummer in this band is the GOAT. That's probably initially why I really got into this album. Is just the drumming is ridiculous, the patterns are crazy. It's it's like he's playing, or she, I'm not sure, but they're playing prog-esque or jazz fusion-y sort of patterns, but with the sort of frenziness of the drummer from the Minutemen or something, right? And then the other thing I have noticed that's in this album, and a lot of albums similar to it, is they actually, probably inspired by, I assume, Bill Bruford, they utilize the snareless snare so well.
I was going to say, this is doubles down on the Bruford method, I think.
Yeah, for sure. This guy must have been a big Bruford fan. There's a bit of the can drummer in here too.
Oh, Jackie, yeah.
But mostly Bruford, I feel.
Excuse me.
And it's more like the easy listening. We'll get to your last pick, obviously, at the end. But it's sort of like the easier listening version of that. And as far as like I said, I really dig the sound palette on it because it goes through a few different styles, but even probably my favorite songs on here are more in the vein of a 90s down tempo, even trip hoppy release, and then it has these electronics going over it, G-funk keyboards and stuff like that. Yeah, I think I just love it for an instrumental, mostly instrumental. There's a few little bits of singing here and there. Similar to early Felt, where it's mostly instrumental, but then you hear or even LC, the Druid Column album, you just hear little whispers of singing, and then maybe a little female vocal, and it's mostly just for mood. Obviously I can't understand Japanese, but I assume it's they just you can tell they're repetitive lyrics, and it's just this album's a real mood piece. I don't know what it is. It's really. When listening to it again recently, because I got the record of this one, I've sort of spun it for years now, and I was just thinking when listening to it recently, I was just looking at the album cover, and it always fascinated me. It's a sort of, what would you call it? It's like a textile factory.
Yeah, some factory image.
A cotton gin or something. And I think I realized that that photo is a great metaphor for just kind of post-rock in general.
Oh.
These sort of automated machines coming to kill more organic rock music or whatever, but these guys are incorporating that with the sort of older style. It's a great combination of the organic and the mechanical, I feel.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, these mechanical things are built by organic.
Yeah.
They're made in metal. It's melted down from fire. It's smelted. You wouldn't. It's something that's timber would be considered organic, but the metal, it's no, that's too far. It's kind of interesting where and I'm sure some people might point out where the dichotomy, where something that an anthropogenic element, versus something which occurs more independently in nature, let's say, of human activity. But you do wonder, if it's created by human beings, isn't it still to some extent part of the environment? I mean, I guess I guess there's the distinction in the category, anthropogenic or creation or whatever.
Sure.
Um,
But yeah, yeah. So you get what I kind of that intuitive sort of feeling I get about what this sort of album at least represents to me, like on a sort of like superficially philosophical level, but also on like a musical level as well. Yeah, I just ever since I first heard it, I was just like, yes. But even though it's interesting as well because this album, like this band, it seems to be like fairly moderately popular. Of all things, they were signed to like a Midwest like emo label, Side One Dummy, which is how I would have like first heard of them. Which is like, I guess more encapsulated on their first album, which is it's good, but I hate the title of it. It's got like, look it up. It's like something about
I know the album,
the vague anxiety of the plot, or something like that.
the book about my idle plot on a vague anxiety.
Yeah, I just that sort of theme and concept. I like the sound of that album. Like it's more like the cover of that one suggests, naturalistic, and it's got a deer or whatever. Whereas I don't know. I find maybe most math rock is very like wooden and naturalistic though. Whereas this one just does something different. I feel it just has more to say.
Well, I'll give a bit of my context because, like, I knew this album because you had the record and you played it a couple of times, and I thought it was, it seemed decent. I didn't really get an in-depth experience with it, but I remember thinking it seemed alright. And going into this again, I didn't realize that I'd actually experienced a little bit of this band in the interim, or at least at some point when the previous. When I was, say, circa 2021, at some point, I would have actually listened to the album, the book about my idle plot on a vague anxiety, and I, one day, between, around midday or so, as most albums I would listen to, I guess, during that time, and I really, really, really enjoyed it, and I thought that this is terrific. Maybe I need to think more about this band again someday. And it's only until like today when I realised, I remembered this album because I was looking up Togue as I'm listening to this for your pick. I'm like, these two.
Oh, nice, yeah.
And I actually way prefer the first one. Like to me,
interesting.
It's way more interesting. The first one sounds way more interesting to me.
Okay.
Not that there's nothing of interest on the second album, but the thing is, like, I feel like For Long Tomorrow, it's solid, but I feel like it goes through the motions musically a little bit. Like, I feel like it's a bit, it's, I guess, a little bit abrasive in its aesthetic, but it's also kind of predictable in its own way, right? Like, it's kind of just fitting the genre mold that I come to expect.
Interesting.
From this sort of band, slightly.
That's sort of what I meant by it's like a more easy listening equivalent.
Well, yeah, that's fair.
Because it finds a groove and it sort of fits into the groove and then sort of ruminates or like builds around that. Like I mentioned, the sound palette. I agree. I don't think it's like a structurally experimental or like far out there album. I think it's mostly just an experiment in how to get like a clean, fresh sort of sound.
It's certainly that.
In the mood sort of sense.
Yeah, in a technical production sense, it's really pristine.
There's which is more where
obviously.
I sort of fit in with this album.
Well, you mentioned as well your appreciation of the drumming. I'm not. I've never played the drums. So this is sort of a bit lost on me. I don't really. There are things
the
people
drums
pick up about people like Bruford and Pitt, even though I love listening to those guys, but I never think to notice. I mean, like, I love listening to, like if I listen to Joe's Garage on headphones, I absolutely love listening to just the sole drum track of Vinnie Colaiuta on that album. But like, I can only imagine how actual people who've played the toms, might feel about that sort of thing. So my appreciation of that particular instrument, or any, I don't actually play any of them, it is. And so, obviously there's that. But yeah, just in terms of my own personal listening enjoyment, I find the first one a lot more captivating. I haven't listened to the albums 3 and 4 yet. They seem quite interesting. I would like to listen to them at some point.
Neither have I. I should check them out, because I've only heard the first 2, yeah.
But don't get me wrong, like, I do think it's pretty solid, and I would like, and if we're being like, I don't like rating things out of 10 or anything, but if I would definitely give it like a 7 out of 10, you know.
Nice.
And
I would give it like an 8 or something.
And if we're going the sort of school grading route, I'd give it like a B-.
Nice.
Which sounds nicer, I think.
Yeah, I'd probably say about like an A-.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. That sort of thing.
Yeah, that's essentially where I'm at with this. Yeah, but it was still pretty good. I don't mean to sound too harsh there, because they've put together good work here, I think.
Yeah, no, that's not harsh at all.
Yeah, that's where I'm at. Do you want to move on now, actually?
Yeah.
Because we're on another sort of... apparently sort of math... Well, what it's called here is, on your music, is mathcore. Now, I'll tell you how I came across this album. I think I was looking through mathcore after I got into his collective.
Right.
But his collective's not the first. The group that actually got me into that sort of music was an act called, which I got into via the album art, called Wormrot. They're from Singapore.
Yeah, right.
And I remember thinking, like, I've never enjoyed this music when I listened to it because of the cover. And it's and initially, like, you'd think I'd be disappointed because I don't really listen to grindcore. I knew it was going to be that sort of genre, but I decided to give it a listen. And I was like, probably, yeah. And I found myself genuinely enjoying it in a way I haven't really that genre before. Maybe I haven't listened to the right groups or even just considered it enough in general, intrinsically, in the first. But, you know, I'm listening to it, like, this is really enjoyable. I don't know if it's where the production's at, where the composition's at creatively, but I was like, this is pretty fucking awesome, actually. Wowza. And then I get into his collective later, which is fantastic. I talked about that before. Really like that release. And then we had, so I see this sort of Ram on the cover. I see a kind of provocative title, and I guess slightly ahead of its time. Though, of course, when this album's from 2006, the group is actually formed in 2004, and this is the second Intifada ended in 2005. But you know, the hot issue.
Yeah, it's very topical. I was thinking that
the album had come out after the Intifada ended. But the second Intifada would have come to a close officially. But well, actually, for what it's worth,
there was a war in Lebanon.
For what it's worth, no, that's true. I was just thinking that they attacked Lebanon around that time, not Gaza. Well, they're always doing shady shit in Gaza, no matter what the year.
Sure.
Even if it's even before this and the one before, but no. So I see the title and I see the
goat reminded me of that evil character from the Vivitch.
Oh, Black Phillip, but that's a different film. Yeah, Robert Eggers. Yeah, good stuff. Good director. Like him a lot. Yeah, so I listened to this out of curiosity, and also, well, I don't think I listened to it then. I came across it then, and then when I saw it I was looking for 2000s albums to discuss one day on the show, and I saw it again there.
Nice.
And I was just like, oh yeah, might as well listen to it now. And I'm like, yeah, fuck yeah, like this is great. I'm like, weren't there supposed to be like a lot of bands that had this sort of sound? Why is it that I'm only enjoying this one? I'm like, well, that's not the question I need to be asking. I need to, like, false modesty. Let's throw that aside. Why is this the only interesting of these fucking bands that seem to exist? And I'm like, of metal bands, and I realized, well, actually, even though it sounds like metal to me, like, it's not metal. It's not metal. They call it mathcore.
Yeah.
But to a casual audience, it doesn't really. The casual audience just thinks this is metal. I understand when you listen to the genres and all different acts more so, these designations become more useful. But in the same way that, like, you know, a casual audience no matter what category of jazz they hear, it's just jazz to them. It could be, you might say, oh no, it's swing, oh no, it's hard bop, post pop, free jazz, Dixieland. To the casual audience, it's just jazz.
Well,
and both ways of looking at it are valid. You know what I mean? Depending on how much you.
Just depends.
How much it's useful.
Depends on
what the definition is useful in the context of the discussion.
Yeah, it's if you're talking micro or macro.
Sure, yeah, and so I'm like, this is the core kind of metal that I enjoy, and even if like we can actually call it something more specific, then so be it. It's a more interesting variant creatively, compositionally of that form. And I think about like metal in the 2000s, and it's just like, well, metal in general, I've always felt a bit like, don't get me wrong, like when acts like Slayer came up and Def came up and did their thing, that's fucking excellent stuff. But then like there's just these kind of knockoff imitator bands, and to me, like, I'm not inspired enough to be just subculturally indebted to knockoffs of these bands.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Like, I'm not, like, I agree that the Def and Slayer are basically, you know, geniuses for what they do, but to me, it's just not, I don't find this the sort of just. Even though they're little prog outfits that put out one album, and like if it's Easter Island or Shadowfax, or they're both from America, funnily enough, in the later 70s. But like even still, like within the parameters there, they're doing something very bouncy and energetic and sort of captivating and like lush production. Whereas like, given the nature of what Slayer and Def are doing, it's necessarily quite experimental and out there, like even for what it is, and it's hard to be creative within those limits, really, especially when, like, if someone's pioneered those, like, sort of minimal, highly experimental spaces. I think it's a bit too tempting for the guys coming afterward to just copy those people. And then you get all these avant-garde acts like Merzbauer, who are doing very experimental things, seemingly, but is it actually that imaginative? And the plain answer is really just no.
Merzbauer's a bit like that, I find, as well.
I used to have one Merzbauer album on my iTunes years ago, and I'm sure they have better ones with that one. It's from like 2011. I'm just like, after a while, I'm just like, no, to be honest. Like, this is nothing on Godspeed You Black Emperor. Maybe they have other albums that are, but I haven't heard them yet.
Sure.
I know
they've got like 100 albums.
Yeah, but that one seemed to be quite well liked in particular, and I was just like,
I think I know the one you're talking about.
To be honest, I just don't think there's as much imagination here, no matter how much
that's an interesting way to frame it, because I sort of felt similar listening to this album. I thought it was a really good balance of creativity and technicality. Like, it opens up with these like sludgy sort of like heavy bass riffs, and I'm like, oh, sick, I think I'm gonna like this. And but then, like, in between, like, thrashing and stuff like that, and, sort of quick beats, it'll then, like, has interesting breakdowns, but the breakdowns aren't the emphasis either. It's more like these, like, sort of more elongated, like, outros, where it almost goes even, once again, into, like, post-rock territory. And I was like, oh, yeah, people forget, before, the really Ridley Diddley post-rock, like, Slint had, like, Nosferatu Man. It was meant to be just as heavy and visceral as something like this sort of metal got to, Yeah. I felt it occupied a similar sort of space. And it's funny you brought up Death, because this sort of also reminded me of that, like, late 90s Death album. So it's funny you said this is considered mathcore, like we were saying on the micro.
Mathcore and in sludge metal, not in bold.
Yeah, sludge, sure, yeah. Because it's got the sludgy bass going.
Yeah, that was a trend at the time.
But I'm like, what's the difference between mathcore and technical death metal? I guess if you're really involved, you know the differences. But on a sort of broader level, I completely agree. It doesn't quite matter that much. But outside of the sort of technicality of the music, I think the thing I really liked about this album is how sort of like apocalyptic it is.
Yeah.
Like, I love the sort of Y2K to like 2010 sort of very like apocalyptic. Like, it really does suit the sort of that aspect of the human condition that sort of yearns for violence, or sort of, there's a sort of the Bukowski mind state or something, of just this idea of like there being some part within the human condition that just sort of loves suffering in a way.
Quite a mass Martian, yeah.
Yeah, sure. And something like this is just great to sort of evoke that, I suppose, if you're in the mood. Like, I could see where this is obviously not music for everybody.
Of course, yeah.
But if you're a fan of like interesting visceral music, and something like this is a treat, because not only is it visceral, but it keeps you interested with sort of strange technical sides,
Yeah.
And the one thing is, though, I similar to jazz sometimes, when I'm listening to an album like this, I wish I was watching it live, like seeing the band and listening live, rather than it being an LP.
Oh, yeah.
Something about metal just, or like this very visceral metal just doesn't translate as well to the leisure music listening sort of place,
That's possibly true.
It is good that you can have it to take around with you, because you can't always be at shows and stuff like that.
Of course.
But I really want to see this live in 2006, more than even like listen to the LP, if that makes sense.
Of course.
And I think that's a sort of a compliment to the band, I think live these guys would really go off. And in a way, maybe the LP limits it a bit, but like I said, that's sort of, in the grand scheme of things, inconsequential. I'd rather have the convenience of being able to listen to it.
I'd question how many interesting metal albums you can make in the history of humankind, because the thing is, like, there was some interesting stuff in the 2000s. Like, I kind of like the prog metal-y stuff like Dream Theater, but that's just because I like Rush, and they're just doing kind of that on steroids in a way.
Yeah.
And then, I think about the sludge act like Mastodon. I love Leviathan. I don't love the albums after Leviathan. Some of them are okay, but I feel like they nailed something there, sort of concept album-y, and it was really, really sort of creative and brash with bold production. But the stuff after that seems a bit sort of like, I don't know, I feel like they really believed in the Leviathan concept and they were so inspired, and then afterward they're just trying to like replicate what worked for them, it was a big breakout album. And they're still doing fairly creative things, but I just feel like they're just sort of going through the motions, even though the motions can be pretty good sometimes. There's a couple Mastodon albums that are, like the Emperor of Sands or whatever that was called, I thought that was pretty good, but the Going Through the Sun album from I think 2015 I didn't think was very good. I didn't enjoy that much. But I guess the point is, it's like, I wish there were more interesting metal albums, and one rocked up in the 2020s we talked about on the show called it was called Plague God by Absent and Body. It's their only album thus far. They're from Belgium, and when I heard that album, I'm thinking, gee, like, where's all the interesting metal been? Like, obviously we talked about Acid Bath recently. There's a very raw form, very ugly, sludgy, obviously, music, and that's occupying its own space. But like, even in terms of like, I guess, more well produced sort of like interesting like horror metal, Absent and Body occupied something which I just like. This is always kind of what I wanted from the genre, that album. But also stuff like this.
Yeah.
Potentially has more of a, I guess this is the mathcore designation coming in, potentially has more of like a punk bend. Maybe it's something about like the drumming being tighter than like sort of like, way, just intricate.
It's got the core, definitely, yeah.
The core, yeah. Like, maybe like, on like the metal end of, really hardcore punk, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Metallic hardcore.
Like, obviously, like, this doesn't sound like Death or Slayer, you know what I mean?
Parts of it, when it's like going into the sludgy thing with the sort of strange bridges,
to say.
It sounded like that later later Death.
Death, yeah.
Not early Death.
That very sort of like in-your-face death metal.
Yeah. They call it, like I said earlier, technical death metal or whatever. Whereas I don't think early Death would be classified as technical death metal. Honestly, that's more just straightforward, like, chugging sort of stuff.
Yeah, like, the later Death is, like, avant prog metal, you know?
Exactly, yeah.
Actually.
And, yeah, this sort of was a bit of that, prog metal, and a bit, like I was saying, post-rocky, the sort of, like, post-metal, that brief thing that was around in the early 2000s.
Oh, yeah.
You know, like, what were they called?
ISIS,
yeah, and...
not to be confused with ISIL.
What was I forget the other big post-metal band.
Hellion? No.
Nah, I was thinking of another one I was reminded of. But anyway, it doesn't matter that much. It was sort of a brief flash in the pan, sort of... Oh, Jesu, that's the one I was thinking of.
Oh, sure, the Sunken Moon Cloud.
Yeah. Which I think is like the guy from Godflesh or something.
Oh, yeah.
I never really listened to them. What are they like?
I remember the famous Godflesh album I tried to listen to once. I was like, I don't care for this. Sorry, guys. More power to you, but not my thing.
Is it from the 90s?
I respect their 90s, 2000s. I respect the conviction, but it's just I just don't find it, in the nicest way possible, I just don't find it that listenable.
Yeah, I can't say I've ever heard it.
Yeah. Sorry, guys, again. Yeah. But very positive reception on this album, and I did have a little bit of a listen to the next two, and they were quite good too, especially the third album's similarly well rated to this first one, and it's quite good, from 2012, another year where tensions were heating up in that region actually. They disbanded in 2013.
Okay.
The members might have moved on to other things. There's a few related artists here, Bird Eater, Cult Leader, and Day of Less. Maybe I'll check those out in the near future. Could be very interesting, but no, in any instance, good on you guys. If you choose to reunite, that sounds awesome. Tour of Sydney if possible, but also if you choose not to, but we'll reunite one way. I'd love to see you, but don't feel I'd love to hear a fourth album, but if you just want to keep like a great sort of consistent trilogy as is, I mean, few bands can ask for a solid and consistent discography seemingly as that.
Nice.
You know, at least not without someone, you know, passing away in an untimely manner. But,
Rest in peace, Roy Haynes.
Yeah, hey, he was a great jazz drummer.
Yeah.
Really great.
I couldn't believe he was 99.
He was one of the oldest. He was one of the ones that was still alive. Like everyone else has
60s,
passed away, but he was the only one of those classic jazz drummers.
40 in the 60s. That's crazy, yeah.
He, I'd like to point out his work in particular. Well, let me just double check. I believe it's Roy Haynes, but Red Garland has an album called Equinox, which is really, really good, which was released in '79. And yes, that was correct. Roy Haynes on drums.
Nice.
Spectacular.
He's such a good drummer. It's
he's one of the greats.
He's one of my favorite. Yeah.
I think my favorite is I love Elvin Jones.
He's good.
No one better than Elvin Jones. Max Roach is nuts. Buddy, of course. Kenny Clark's really good.
Man.
A lot of those jazz drummers are just. I mean, we mentioned like some of the later fusion or like a younger guy like Clayuta and Steve Gadd.
What's the guy's name?
Chick Webb's another one who's really good.
Tony Williams.
Oh, Tony Williams is probably the best actually.
Yeah,
Tony Williams does things which I don't know how, and he's got a great. There's that brilliant interview where Tony Williams is saying like, you know, you gotta, you know, the big mistake that most drummers are making is they're putting too much of the tension in the wrist. Like, you got to put the tension into like your palms.
Interesting.
Like, you know, like because you don't want your wrists getting tired. You know, you want all the power just going into the drums, and also like you want to be sure what you're hitting. You can't have any moments where you're having a leap of faith as a drummer.
Sure.
Which is at least in
Precise,
the kind of music that Tony was playing. You know.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's sort of snap with the palms, because most drummers will tell you 101. Yeah, you sort of. Obviously, the bounce comes from the wrist, but you're balancing it in between your fingers, your index and your middle.
This is probably worth mentioning. I'm speaking of we were talking about Bill Bruford. Speaking of drumming, we were talking about Bill Bruford before, and speaking of and collaborations with you know, Japanese fusion. It's worth recommending. I can't remember what the recording's called, or if it's more than just like a live performance, but. Bill Bruford and the brilliant bassist Jeff Berlin and Japanese fusion guitarist Kazumi Watanabe. That's some of the coolest fusion trio stuff you'll ever hear. There's some of the only stuff that readily competes with it off the top of my head is the brilliant trio of Doom, which was the aforementioned Tony Williams with Jaco Pastorius and John McLaughlin, I believe.
Oh yeah.
That's. Oh no, it was Alan Holdsworth. No, Alan Holdsworth was in Tony Williams' band briefly, but the trio of Doom was John McLaughlin, but there was an album during the Tony Williams lifetime where it's like Holdsworth with Tony Williams, and it's like Wooshka. And actually, you know who said that the Tony Williams lifetime was their favorite album, the 1969 album. Andy Partridge, of all people, said that's his favorite album.
Yeah,
Andy Partridge doesn't make music that sounds like that, but for some reason, I guess that's just the album he personally enjoys the most.
In a weird way, that I get it. Yeah,
his approach to pop music is so intricate, creative, and unpredictable. Yeah, like so in that, but it's very Paul McCartney, but it's also very like it's almost like McCartney on steroids at times.
And jazz chord changes, similar to like the Minutemen. Like, you know that song "Love on a Farm Boy's Wages." Like right in the bridge, there's just this sudden chord change.
What album's that on?
Mama.
Okay.
It's just like a weird chord change. It's kind of genius.
I'd probably know it if I heard it.
Yeah,
I don't know the song names.
You'd probably know it if you heard it. Yeah.
Can't touch titles to songs. And
albums, especially with a band that has like fucking 12 albums.
Yeah, most of them are amazing actually.
But this was a pretty sick one. I have to agree.
Good stuff.
Do you want to move on from drummers to drum machines?
I'd love to, go for it.
Yeah. Alright, the next one we got is PWEI, The Pop Will Eat Itself. And the album is got a convoluted title, but I kind of like it. This is the day, this is the hour, this is this. From what year is it? 89?
Yes.
And, where do I start with this one? I don't think I'm going to be able to say everything I want to say. Because I have a lot to say, but anyway, it's just, what would you call it? A sort of like post-punky, like rap, like sample Delia album.
Well, don't they have a word for this that you've been talking about recently?
Grebo, that's right.
It sounds like a Star Wars alien character.
It does, yeah. The Grebo movement. Yeah, that's right. I guess I heard of this band like because they were touring Australia about a year ago, and this old British guy I work with, aptly named Guy, is like, mate, you gotta check it out. He's the guy who like put me onto the Psych Furs and a few other bands, probably albums I've brought up on this show as well. And I was just like, oh, that sounds like a silly name. Yeah, I'm sure it's all right. And I just didn't really bother until like recently declaring myself the world's first baggy historian. I was like, I gotta look into Grievo, I suppose. And I guess that's how these guys came back up again. And I was like, oh, that's right. That British guy was saying get on it. I mean, it took me about a year or two to get on the Furs, so maybe this will be all right. And yeah, man, there's something about like this English like grimy like post-punk grunge dance hip hop music. Like there's a funny quote I found on the band's Wikipedia page that like the lead singer said to describe what Grievo is, and he's just like, it's music for fighting, fucking, and smoking cigars or something like that. Like there's just something about I just love the sort of like in your face Gen X attitude of the whole movement. Like
Sure.
There's just something sort of like I guess I'll get into it a bit more later in regards to the music, but like, you know, I've brought up a few times on this show this idea of like taste and subtlety being a virtue in most music, but sometimes I find, especially if it's trying to be like polemic, or in the case of this, like, you know, a sort of McLuhan-esque like multimedia pop cultural, you know, Illuminatus trilogy type takedown thing. Similar to like Helter Stupid, Negative Land thing. There's something about, or like Bong Water. KLF. There's something about being like KLF is the other big citation that this is sort of like a better version of those first two KLF albums where they're doing the white British rap thing in a way. But like just the audacity to have no taste.
They weren't KLF when they did those two though.
Nah, they're the Ancients of Mu.
Yeah, just to be technical, I suppose.
Yeah. It's technically different, I suppose. Yeah.
Same wiki article.
But yeah, I guess the first thing as well that sort of attracted me to this album was weirdly particular as well. It was like the single or whatever was in a Grievo playlist, and it was called Wise Up Sucker. And it just made me laugh because of that weird, there's like a British conspiracy channel where...
Yeah, it's
like
called Wise Up.
A Scottish guy just points at pictures of like blurry photos of stones and says that giants existed, and he's like, it's about time you're wise up.
Well, he looks at these photos of the Easter Island statues.
Yeah.
It's funny because we're going to see one of those on a...
Yeah.
And I mentioned the band Easter Island before. But he talks about how like... So, you guys know about Pompeii, right? And how there's those people who are petrified. And you know how he mentioned that he believes in giants? Well, Easter Island. Now, what's really interesting, he insists the famous Easter Island statues, I don't remember what they're called, I apologize, I probably ought to, do I know? Well, I didn't know we were talking about Easter Island today. Even though it's on one of the covers. Anyway, he doesn't think the famous ones, with the long noses, he doesn't think those are giants. There are multiple different types of statues on Easter Island. He thinks some of the other ones were in fact giants, which were petrified in some sort of, I assume, a volcanic eruption of sorts, or some other incident. I don't know if he's one of the mud flood people as such.
Yeah, he is, I think.
Oh, is he?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure
they all are. Holy crap. No, but he's like, he has these blurry photographs, he like, draws like a red circle around it, and he's like pointing at it, and as you can see here, clearly. No, he thinks like a lot of stone is actually petrified wood, and it's nuts. But like, it's crazy.
Yeah, and so that's what, I guess initially I was just like, I suppose saying wise up's like a Britishism or whatever, but like it was just, it reminded me of that song, musically, it sort of reminded me of like a Killing Joke song in a way. But you know that Henry Rollins band song where he's just yelling at his fans for having low self-esteem? Yeah. I was like, this is like a good version of that, you know? Just like some guy telling you to like just wise up, using like, you know, that old silly nursery rhyme or whatever. The she loves me not thing. I was like, man, it's sort of weirdly creative, just a little punchy like pop song, or like pop grunge sort of song or whatever, alt rock. But then like as I was listening to the album, like it just went into, you know, the next thing is like the funky drummer being sampled or whatever, and I didn't even realize the band was going to be like vaguely like, you know, Public Enemy inspired hip hop or whatever. And then there's just something about just the sort of the density of the sampling and stuff like that. Like it feels like almost the music is more like an experiment in multimedia, as well as like pop music. Like even there's one of the songs where I noticed one of the lyrics. He's just talking about how he walks around, just like singing and humming, like songs he's making up as he's going, you know. And I felt like that's the sort of musical philosophy of this album in a weird way. It's like it feels like it was made by like music nerds or something, you know, more so than musicians, you know.
Yeah.
They're like curators or whatever, and that's how that sort of mixture of like art sensibilities and like polemics crosses over into like musical quotations and sampling and stuff like that, and even like the one of the great songs on the album is called like "The Fuses Are Being Lit." It's like a big like collage piece or whatever, and just got all these different, you know, bits of like Terminator and like RoboCop and things like that being sampled. And then all of a sudden, like you just hear, and John Elway throws the touchdown. I'm like, man, these guys are madmen. Like just that sort of place and all the strange like cultural references as well. Like this draws heavily from obviously like I said, multimedia. Even a song toward the end is just saying TV, movies, comics. And then there's all these like comic book references. Like one of the choruses, they just say, Watchmen. I'm like, man, I'm so glad that there's this like not only dense like cultural reference, but also like a historical sort of musical collage sort of artifact that is also sort of pop in a way. It's a very appropriate band name for what the music is.
Yeah, yeah.
And what do you reckon? I do have a bit. One thing I'll say later.
Okay, well, I suppose it's. I don't know what to say. Like it's. It's
hard to describe.
I think it's brilliant, but and I just don't. It's coming from a very creative, interesting place. Like, what is this like? The milk from Chelton of the sample era, like,
yeah.
Like, I don't know, like because that post punk sort of gave way to this sort of like technologically sort of like all the new technology sort of taking place with the guitars, bass, and drums sort of thing. If you KLF or a Negative Land or all the sort of EDM groups like 808 State. But my God, like that song on there. Which one is it? Alan Moore Knows the Score.
Oh, can you dig it?
Yeah, like, I mean, my goodness, like, what a, Daddy Harry, it's just like, that's a fascinating, it's very bold to do something like that, and like, just like being in on like Alan Moore in the 80s would have been like nuts. Like, obviously we all know about Alan Moore in the 2000s, because, I imagine some of us, like, saw that V for Vendetta was a thing, and then we kind of looked that up, and like, oh, who's Alan Moore? And then you realise, like, oh, this for a comics author, this guy is, like, really, really interesting. It was almost like finding out about Stanley Kubrick for the first time.
It's like cosmic, yeah.
And, and it's like, you realise that all these really acclaimed but very different films came from this guy, and you're like, as opposed to Hitchcock, where, there's all this sort of a theme running through it. With Kubrick, or, in the comics equivalent, like Alan Moore, you're kind of like, how does this all fit together? Because, you write Stan Lee with all these sort of typical sort of characters, all vaguely similar to one another, with these problems and blah, blah, blah. The 60s, Stan Lee, Jack Kirby. But you find out, you initially learn of it as Stan Lee. Jack Kirby's influence is more talked about now. But, so that's interesting. So Alan Moore seemed very compelling. And then I actually read the works and I was like, you can't believe it. He does know the score.
Yeah, it's an appropriate lyric.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and they had no idea, like, From Hell and A League of Extraordinary Gentlemen didn't even exist yet, and that's like, there's some of his great, but obviously in the 80s he'd had his Swamp Thing series, Watchmen and V for Vendetta, which those alone would, like, I first fell in love with him by just reading first Watchmen and then V for Vendetta. And I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, of course.
Couldn't believe it. But this is a little bit like, now let's talk a little bit about what I adore about Alan Moore's creative process. He does something very ambitious, and like this changed my whole creative world in a way. I remember having ideas of doing something like this before I ever read someone like Alan Moore. Alan Moore's when I realised it could actually really work. and that's you write a list of all the things that you love that you'd love to infuse into one thing, and then you just fucking go for it and you make it work. And like, you know, Watchmen being a distillation of everything that he found compelling about, you know, this masked hero comics and like their relation to like American like social geopolitics in the the pre-war and then post-war period.
And
sort of like V for Vendetta, combining Orwell, David Bowie, you know, British war films, Thatcherism, and all these things into this one like fever dream.
I never thought about the David Bowie connection there, but there is a bit of that sort of.
There's some glam to it, you know what I mean? Especially if you look at like the art design and how like sort of pomp and sort of like, you know. They almost like those they pop like those sort of, not only the 60s comic books, like if you think about those comic-esque like advertisements you'd see in magazines, you know what I mean? Just boom, bam, pow, like the post-psychoanalysis sort of, post-Edmund Bernays sort of, really attempts to just like nab at the psyche like that.
Keep calm and carry on.
Oh yeah. That's interesting. I mean, that came back later in a kind of ironic fashion. You know?
Yeah, that was
because apparently those weren't employed so much during the war.
Okay,
I think I could be wrong. I think I've read ones where like those were a test design that never really got anywhere.
Yeah, because it's a bit cheesy.
I found it corny. It was a bandwagon in the early mid 2010s.
Oh, the meme, of course.
It annoyed me. It drove me up a fucking wall. I'm sure a lot of you guys.
I much prefer the pre-meme sort of cyberpunk experience. The sort of aesthetic that this album has, like, it reminds me of that movie Strange Days.
That's a good one. Yeah, we got to talk about that on the channel one day.
Yeah, nice. But yeah, one thing I noticed when I was.
Oh, can I just
yeah, please.
Just because people are going to be like, why was he talking about Alan Moore just now?
Oh, it's very appropriate.
No, but the reason is like this guy. This is what these guys did.
Yeah,
these guys did the Alan Moore thing.
They did it with music,
that
television,
process I
comics.
mentioned. And I was talking about this on the channel recently because I think where Alan Moore got the idea was from Doctor Who's serial Talons of Wen Chang, combining all the like literature and like iconic fictional icons of that era of Victorian London, like Jack the Ripper, Fu Manchu, bit of Pygmalion, Birkenhair, just all these things are coming together to like just be this sort of like treatise on like, you know, just a place where everything, time and space, is just sort of folding in on each other, almost in like a Borgesian way. Like the story Man on the Threshold being the best example of this, one of my favorite pieces of fiction ever. But yeah, so I had Alan Moore, who his early assignments were Doctor Who comic strips in Doctor Who magazine, and I'm pretty sure he was a fan of the show, and I'm sure that's seems like the genesis of a lot of those ideas. And obviously, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is most explicitly that of Alan Moore's works, but anyway, so go on now.
Yeah, no, I agree. And then the Alan Moore tangent, yeah, like you were saying, it's very appropriate. And yeah, like, I don't know, I listened to this album quite a few times in a short space of time because I felt like a weird sort of kinship, like you were saying, like similar to how we're just going on diatribes about this sort of stuff, the things we enjoy, right? It feels that's just the sort of ethos of this group, and this album particularly. Like even one of the sort of, in a weird way, like lesser songs on the album, because probably have one with the most rapping, the Radio PWEI song. I still really like that because like just the idea of like the song is just that like they can't live without their radio. And I'm like, that's literally in a weird way just my life, always walking around listening to music as I work. Like I really do feel that, you know, you just, it wouldn't be the same. Like the world would be less colourful, you know, without music in that sort of sense. Which is sort of the sample dealia ethos as well in a way, you know, before it was ruined by legalisms. And I was curious whether Robert Christgau ever commented on this group, and he does comment on them in like an essay for like an end of year thing or whatever, and was like, it was interesting, because like I don't remember the exact sort of thing he was saying, but he was talking about whether like the whole sample philosophy will wear thin and people get bored of it, or whether like he saw it as unfortunate, like it'll be stifled by the courts. And it did end up getting stifled by the courts before people got bored of it. And I think a great example of that is when, like, I think that's why, like, the Avalanches, that album I talked about, you know, Since I Left You, when that came along in 2000, that's like after nearly a whole decade of that sort of ethos and philosophy being, essentially, the music industry rejects it.
Yeah,
because
it had its legs broken.
Yeah, it had yeah, essentially the courts are being the mafia. Yeah, that's a great metaphor for it. Whereas that then comes along and is like even denser with the sampling. Like that's got
and
more
stuff
songs
which
on
people
it.
couldn't, go at them after. You know, what I mean, just very obscure things that no one was
Yeah.
seeking to like get some bank over.
Yeah,
Stuff
yeah.
that was either like public domain or the sample was so small as to be irrelevant or like unrecognizable.
And I feel that album is like philosophically, linked to this one. I'm where maybe they were fans. I suspect because like obviously aesthetically it doesn't have the sort of grebo grungy alt rock thing. It's more like the house and dance of around the year 2000 aesthetically. But just the way that album like is sequenced sort of goes. It'll have like a song and then it'll have like a minute and a half interlude where it samples things from the previous song that you just listened to, mixing it in with other things, and then it all flows through in this very like naturalistic way.
Yeah.
As a collage, like the sequence is also a collage, and that's what this album does as well. And I remember seeing an Avalanche's bit when they're on the kids' music show Recovery in Australia. Before Since I Left You.
Oh.
And they're doing like a Beastie Boys-esque like rap. It's kind of like this sort of thing, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They sounded more like this before they then lent into the aesthetics of house and like, dream pop jazz stuff and, various sort of more eclectic things. I was just, I wonder, if I ever met the Avalanches guys, I would ask them because I feel like Chris Gow was saying, it ended up getting stifled by the courts, this whole philosophy, and very few things came along after that sort of kept it going. Like some hip-hop artists, Vaporwave eventually came along, but it never quite reached the heights of like mainstream music even at the time. Like I'm sure some sample stuff got pretty high in the charts.
Well, because they forked over the money, they could afford to.
Yeah, or even before that court case.
Oh,
like
right,
I'm thinking
right.
like Vanilla Ice or something. Let's say,
Sure.
There was
afterward, obviously, like there was like Puff Daddy and he was the two most famous occasions of Kashmir and Sting's song, or Police song, excuse me.
and Matume.
Right, yeah.
On the Biggie song.
Yeah, because those, like, obviously he such as a record company could afford to pay for those samples. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and instead of having like
Or the Verve,
like,
that was a big one.
Out of curiosity, I went on the Who sampled for this album, and every song has like 10 or 12 samples, whereas by that point, a song has like one sample.
Yeah, exactly.
Even at one point,
it pillages the whole song. Or like Tupac was the famous one.
Yeah,
Daft Punk with Robot Rock. That was a bit later though.
Yeah, though that does just loop one quote, but it does, in the Daft Punk way, just repeat it for the whole song. So it's a bit sus, I agree.
Yeah. It would be a great song if the original didn't exist. You know what I mean? Like the Robot Rock.
Sure.
Big Breakwater. When I actually listen to Breakwater Release the Beast, that's one of the great songs of all time.
Or if they just didn't, if they used that sample but didn't base the whole song around it, if you know.
Well,
what I mean.
yeah.
It's
if only they came up with that.
Because it's a great noise to sample. Like, it should be sampled.
I'm convinced that people who like the Verve song Bittersweet Symphony don't know. They think they came up with this like immaculate classical arrangement. It's like that's from like a Stones song, and that's not even theirs. I think that's that's like a prior. I mean, it's a classical piece. The recording is theirs, but it's and then in the recording of their track or whatever, but. It's playing a pre-existing composition.
Yeah, I think that song was just pillaging off the sort of popularity of Portishead. Because they're maybe the ones who brought sampling in from the mid to late 90s and did it in a sort of more clever way,
Yeah, Portishead seemed quite seamless.
Because I think that Verve song, it's not only that, but it's also got like 2 other samples on it. Like it's got a different drum sample as well. Like there's a few different things it's doing. But it's like I was saying, it's like the really mainstream Britpop rock version of a Portishead song or something,
Oh my god, that's such an ambitious song. They composed a string section for it. That's literally what I think the fans of that song think.
It'd be funny.
They literally think that they composed that string section for that song.
Sure.
It's not something they just pillaged and just like Tupac and Joe Cocker it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's
all it is.
And a song like that, the Joe Cocker, the Kashmir or Bittersweet Symphony. It's the opposite of the ethos of it. Like even like one of the first lyrics on the album is like, So what? We steal. We're Robin Hoods. they're taking all these things to give back to the culture, you know?
This is almost like, I compared it to Alan Moore. It might be more appropriate to compare it to Grant Morrison's Zenith, because Grant Morrison actually kind of cheekily compared himself to hip-hop artists. Because obviously Zenith had a lot of major similarities to what Watchmen did, but Grant Morrison wanted to... He said he loved Watchmen and stuff like Dark Knight Rises, but he said he felt it was like a little bit concept album-y for like the kind of person he was at the time. Like, it's like, this doesn't really resonate with me in my generation. Alan Moore's probably a little bit older, or he was. And Frank Miller's in America. So Zenith is almost like he called it Watchmen remixed by Stock Aitken Waterman, and it also has a lot of, and also he compared it to more so to, he saw more inspiration from Brendan McCarthy, Grant Morrison describes McCarthy's method as just like letting your psyche hang out on the page, and these guys are just letting their psyche hang out on the disc.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, it's straight up, yeah.
Yeah, but it's amazing. Like, I've never heard anything quite like this, even if technically it is similar to like sort of, you know, trends of the late 80s in certain UK alt.
It's hard to classify.
It's just like, but it's not quite like acid house, and it's not baggy, and it's not like hip hop sample dealia, like a little bit.
It's all like, it's a little
that
bit
sample
like,
dealia was barely a scene, and like they're still very distinct from the KLF and from Negative Land, you know.
Yeah, sure. There's, like you said, baggy. There's a bit of Happy Mondays. You know, it's hard to classify.
It's one of the more original albums I've heard in a while, like from any time. I'm just like, where did this come from? It feels like something that might exist now.
Sure.
Like, in terms of its priorities, like obviously technologically this could be done at any point, but it's like it would have just been considered tasteless to do so. But like, you know, you listen to it and like, is it tasteless? Maybe, but I love it. Like, it's like, who cares?
I think
really?
It's doing that in a wise way, like oxymoronically, you know.
Yeah, like it's just fascinating listen, like densely imaginative, very sort of punk and sort of like kind of playfully political in its own way. Like, I mean, in terms of just in terms of like the conviction that like this is a valid form of recorded music, you know what I mean? Like, there's so many people who could like turn their nose up at it, say it's non-serious or it's not that formal, and like, but like, is it enjoyable? Like, you know, at the end of the day, like if I want to listen to this more so than like contemporary, like sort of Bro Hargrove-esque jazz, that's on the music I don't want to listen to, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, mind you, there's people who will listen to that music over this, and like, so everyone wins, you know what I mean? It doesn't matter. And also, like, when I do tend to complain about music, it's more that it's so popular that it sort of suffocates and sort of like reduces the culture. I don't give a shit about a band I don't like that is not really making an impact on the world, you know what I mean?
Sure.
I'm more annoyed at like if, I don't know, like if Ariana Grande was just like a tiny act with like a small following, I could really give a stuff. If Taylor Swift was just some like local,
that's a better example.
In
her
state of origin.
If you
wouldn't give a
if you saw Taylor Swift at the pub or at some little club, you'd be like, oh yeah, she's all right. But the fact that it's just so overexposed or that sort of stuff is just, you know, forced upon the population.
Even something like Post Malone, if this is just some obscure like
that's a
something
great
on
example.
Bandcamp, I'd just be like, this is not my thing. But more power to you.
If I heard Post Malone on Bandcamp, I just think that was awful.
It is, but you wouldn't be annoyed at it existing in the same way.
You probably haven't heard
as opposed to hehearing it on the radio, and you're like, no, this should be banned from public airwaves. No.
That guy, and he had a song this year.
He's on like country rock now, apparently.
With Morgan Wallen or Wallace or something. Yeah, like some big bro country artist. And it's the one song of the year that really has forced its way into the lexicon, where you have to hear it if you walk through just the world. Like I've walked into shops and I'm like, this song again, you know? It's awful. It's a really bad song.
I may have heard it. Hopefully I haven't, I guess.
It's like, I kind of need some help. And it's awful. It's terrible. Yeah, like that's what it sounds like.
I'm dreading hearing that if I do.
Yeah. I think it's worn off a bit now. I haven't heard
God help me.
About a week, thankfully. Hopefully I'll never hear it again.
Well, anyway. I don't know if I have anything more totally interesting to say about this particular album, but it is brilliant. It's probably one of the better things we've discussed on Mandala so far.
Yeah, I was quite surprised how much I liked it.
Me too, actually.
Yeah.
And speaking of stuff, I'm surprised how much I like it.
Yeah.
Here we go.
As this album started, I was thinking exactly the same. I'm like, man, where did you pull this like song of like, so this album of like old like great love ballads that are a bit baroque, like
I'll
Jeremy,
tell
until that Ocean song kicked in, and I was like, I remember this one. I'd forgotten about it, but that's such a great song as well.
Our friend and cast member of Pandemonium, well, there's cast members of Pandemonium present, obviously, Alex Good, introduced me to this song called The Ocean. Maybe he played it for me once and I didn't take much notice of it, but subconsciously I had. Because when he played it for me this one time, he said, listen to this. I couldn't, but it's like it's something I'd heard before and was like coming back to, like The Ocean. Like, no, but like this was amazing. I could not believe how great this song was.
You know what I did realize? The one thing it does sound like that keyboard bit. It's exactly the same as the keyboard bit from that Beach Boys song on Sunflower. Everything all I want to do. You remember that one?
Of course, a beautiful song.
That song, it's like the same. It's such a good keyboard little chord.
I don't think it doesn't sound that similar. Maybe I have to play it. Maybe if I played it back to back.
To be fair, I didn't play it back to back. It resembled it.
Okay,
and that's such a beautiful melody.
No, that's a great
simple,
song.
like
All I wanna do. No, but like, and what happened was I actually thought Richard Hawley was. This is silly me. I thought when I looked up the song on the album, The Ocean, and he said, it's by this guy named Richard Hawley, and I looked it up and said there was an album called Cole's Corner. And silly me, I just assumed he might be Australian because Coles is a shopping. But Coles might exist overseas or at least in the UK.
Oh,
as well.
it said on the little preview thing, which they on the YouTube thing they just pulled from Wikipedia, that it was like a place where lovers would meet in London or something.
Well, while I looked at on the album cover, he's standing out front of. Oh no,
but he's not. He's standing out front of another
Richard Hawley
place.
Cole's Corner. Maybe there's Photoshop they'll just put in there.
No, he's standing outside of. It also mentioned, but he's not standing at Cole's Corner. He's standing outside some other theatre.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fair, of course.
Yeah.
I texted. I should have known. Silly me. But no, he's from the UK, and so. So for a while I thought this was this great Australian song, but of course it's not. The Australians don't write songs that good very often.
Nah.
But the Brits can.
Apparently this guy was friends with Jarvis Cocker as well.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
But no, so that's how I got into the song. It's a magnificent song, and inevitably in 2000s, actually I listened to the whole album fairly recently in like the last
It's a really good
4
album.
weeks. And I'm like, okay, I got to need a 2000s album. Oh hey, I listened to Cole's Corner. And it was really good. Like, it's just, this is, how like a lot of people they're like, I'm a songwriter, I'm going to write some songs, and they just tell stories, and they're not that interesting, and musically it's just like, I don't give a fuck.
Yeah.
But these are songs.
Yeah.
These are just good old school sort of pre-war songs, pre-World War II meaning.
They're
like,
literate, they're melodic, they're emotional.
They're very immediate. They
everything.
also got those stories behind them. It's a magical formula. Like, to me, like, people talk that about how great these country artists are. I find it a bit too storytelling, and like sort of like that twang is a bit repetitive.
It's very
Johnny
literal.
Cash.
Like, they just tell you what's
Willie
happening.
Nelson, that sort of. They're okay, but it's not my thing. Too American, I guess. But even the Australian stuff's a bit too outback for me. I don't know. I can't stand the fucking. Like, with respect to people who live out, I don't want to sound like a city coastal elitist, but I can't East Coast elitist, but I can't stand the fuck. I can't even with the outback. Sorry.
Well, the Outback is.
I want rain. No, but like
Yeah, the Outback's a weird sort of like existential thing.
I don't think it rains enough in Sydney. That's where I'm at. But it's just like a beautiful, like, sort of traditional album. But like that doesn't mean it's like not like creative and evocative in any way. It's very, very modern production, very to the 2000s, but it still sounds very good.
No, it still sounds very good, and I'm sure it would have sounded very good at the time as well.
Very lush, especially if you have like the CD and have it played in the proper system. But like, it's really good.
Yeah, like this is probably what like
it's the kind of album maybe parents or like certain parents would listen to. Then like in other cases, artists, genres like or music like this, you'd think, but it's just very good.
Well, it's half of that because it fits that traditional like old and oldie sort of world, but it also has a sort of wash of the sort of indie canon sort of world.
Oh yeah.
Like it like I mentioned Jarvis Cocker, and I noticed that the Pitchfork gave this like a good review. A good review from all these sort of places.
Interesting.
And it's a bit like sort of. It's like a hi-fi version of like 69 love songs as well. That sort of, golden oldie writing philosophy.
Yeah.
But sort of, I guess done with that, and also that indie rock sort of new sincere production. And the songs are like,
He's in an 80s like jungle band, but they only had EPs.
Okay, cool.
And then a 90s band called Long Pigs.
Okay. Yeah, there you go.
So I guess he was from that world.
He's been around for a while, yeah.
But like a lot of those guys, like Edwin Collins from Orange Juice, he tried to make these sort of albums, not as like lush sort of string arranger, but he like Edwin Collins tried to be a very serious songwriter.
It's like lounge pop. I've heard the popular album he has from like 97 or whatever.
Edwin Collins.
Yeah, and it's similar to this, and also like, yeah, this is like a better version of that perhaps, and also like sort of a better version of like that sort of Paddy McClune, you know, what the like Prefab Sprout are trying to do in the like,
yeah,
80s,
yeah.
You know?
Distinct from that album we discussed on Mandala. That's a different.
That's a different thing. This is just that sort of indie rock meets golden oldie world done.
Yes.
Probably the best that I've ever heard it.
Yeah.
Or like up there, top 5 at least, you know.
Mm.
I was never like a big, like, you brought it up enough probably on the show, the Sufjan Stevens, that sort of thing, you know. Much prefer things like Magnetic Fields, let's say, or at least in more 69.
Yeah, I was
than
saying
like a Sufjan.
I was criticizing Illinois recently. I don't want to be too mean because like Seven Swans is still a lovely album actually.
Okay,
I forgot about that one, and Michigan's quite good, and I thought Carrie and Lowell was quite good, and I think he did some more like kind of crazy experimental like, jazzy stuff recently, which is fairly interesting. I remember listening to that. I'm not confusing him with someone else, I don't think. I'm just going to check that. But while I'm looking that up, I think part of the appeal of this particular album is like it's got the sort of seriousness of like the Gen X era songwriters, but like they want to like bridge the gap between because all that old worldly stuff seems sort of irrelevant and a bit like upper middle class or whatever, and it didn't seem to be sort of real or authentic, and they sort of wanted to, it's almost like these guys like growing up a little bit more and wanting to sort of like translate that authentic energy of the Gen X popular music scenes, at least in the old world, with that sort of like because
sort of married.
Well, think about like Martin Newell in a video on the Cleanest and Venus channel. He says like you got to listen to like Gilbert and Sullivan. You got to listen to Cole Porter because they were brilliant. Like you have to understand why that stuff was so beloved. Even like because Martin Newell makes very sort of Gen X like Beatles-esque music. It's far from like pre-war sort of. I mean, sometimes it can be called music hall-y, but that's Paul McCartney. But. So
that was 60s pop music.
But even though Martin Newell does like those beautiful, like sort of like soft, like piano jazz tracks, you know what I mean? So I guess you can compare it to that sort of.
He does good like waltz ballads.
Yeah. And I guess it was Sufjan Stevens. Like I'm thinking of stuff like Planetarium and The Ascension. Oh, and that Beginner's Mind thing. I heard a bit of that. That was kind of interesting. I haven't heard Javelin yet. That's got good reviews. Interesting. No, but yeah, like Richard Hawley. I took a bit of a sample of his first album, which is another one that's very well received here, called Late Night Final. Listened to the first few songs; it seemed quite good.
Okay.
And
I noticed he had quite a few albums. Yeah.
And I listened to a little bit of a later one called True Love's Gutter, which didn't seem as interesting to me, but more guitar oriented.
Yeah, that had a guitar on the cover, right?
No, actually, Lady Bridge does.
Maybe I was thinking about that.
I haven't heard Lady Bridge. But I'd like to explore it more so. But sometimes I get concerned about like songwriters. Like, there's a lot to the arrangements and the production here, and sometimes songs lose a little bit. Unless they're really good songs, they can lose a bit when they're a bit barren. You know what I mean? Of like elements and sort of I don't know. Like think about how like. Sometimes a jazz track can be really beautiful if it's just a solo piano piece, but like sometimes when it's played with the band, even if the piano is still the dominant instrument, it just adds so much more to it. Like Monk can make those solo tracks brilliant. Like the solo Ruby My Dear is a beautiful thing, but obviously when it's played with a band with like a bass and sort of like little modest drum track as well, it really just becomes something even more magical. And so that's kind of how I feel about like songwriters. Like I don't think arrangements hurt a song. Like obviously Martin Newell's proved that you don't need to be baroque and expensive to have like really elaborate sort of evocative instrumentation or even like much of a band. I mean Cleaner's usually had one other guy with him obviously.
But, there's a few projects where it's just himself, but there was always at least revolving members. And Brotherhood of Lizards, those 3 members, I think.
And it's not like The Greatest Living Englishman's most, and
that's
expensive production, you know what I mean?
No, that was made for like £12,000.
Yeah, exactly. Like, they managed to pull it off there. Like, that's not punk.
They tried to make it as cheap as possible.
Yeah.
But sound as good as possible. They used the Minutemen philosophy, essentially.
Yeah, and obviously Andy had a lot of experience producing, and working with very gifted producers.
Yeah.
From Rundgren to Lord.
And I think it was a bit of his, like...
Gus McAnuff, whatever that guy is. Gus Dudgeon, whatever his name is.
Because I think that was, like, during a hiatus. It was toward the start of a hiatus with XTC.
Yeah, the Wasp stars come out in the late part of the decade. And then nothing else.
And I get the feeling that he was doing a bit of, like, a Paul McCartney Ram sort of situation. You know, trying to get a home studio going. Yeah. So that's a sort of a lo-fi home studio, but sounds good for what it is sort of thing, you know. Whereas this one is top of the line sort of production, very baroque, and almost like I was like, man, I almost wish that Jeremy Harmer album, even though I do love how lo-fi it is, I'd love to hear a version that was also sounded like this. You know,
that's fascinating.
Have best of both worlds.
Yeah. That's a pretty good album. Like, it's a bit like that album's the kind of thing. It's like. It's not that far removed from being like the Harry Shearer, like Spinal Tap-esque parody.
Oh, sure.
But I guess that's part of the appeal, to be fair, just because it was sort of unironic, you know.
Yeah.
And like the fact that Jeremy Harmer himself sort of laughs about it now.
Yeah.
Like, he appreciates that people are fond of it, / sell it for such a high price, but not that he sees the money from it. But in any instance, so that's Richard Hawley's Cole's Corner. Really, really good album. It's the kind of album that you could play for your parents, they'll enjoy it, and is also good music, which is kind of a unique thing, maybe. I'm not making fun. But no, seriously, I like this a lot. Recommend it. Great 2000s album. Yes. Who says there's no classics in the 21st century? Well, actually, people don't say that, but they kind of cut off on
maybe like,
after the 2010s, everything was shit. No, okay.
Maybe like old people say that.
Maybe, yeah.
They don't even think the 2000s is good. Except for people who like tried to stay with it, they'll say like the Strokes are good and stuff.
I sometimes think of the 2000s as more interesting than the 90s because like a lot of the like I don't know. I think some of the production, like the loudness, sort of the sonics of the 90s, sort of like bother me a little bit. And I like the clean. I love that clean, like sort of slick hip hop sound of the 2000s. Cannibal Ox, Dalek. Cunning Linguists, obviously all the Doom / Madville and stuff. Like, hip hop sounded awesome in the 2000s. Not taking away from any of the cool 90s stuff, like Redman or Jeru or Diggable Planets or even the underground stuff from Memphis, Tommy Wright, Coopster, Nika, etc. Sorry, go on.
Oh, yeah, well, I was just going to say, I guess 2000s rock production at the top line is kind of annoying in the same way. Like a Kaiser Chiefs or something like that, the first Arctic Monkeys album. But when it's coming from indie labels, I do... That New Sincerity sound is how I've described it. I do like that sound.
It sounded better than ever. I dare I say, I was just thinking about this. The compositions aren't that strong. One of the songs, the most famous song on there is okay. But, kind of basic, but, you know... The production on that Franz Ferdinand album proves that digital production and rock didn't need to be a mismatch.
No, I agree.
That album sounds perfect.
I feel the same about that.
It was a very expensive production, I'm sure.
Yeah.
To be fair.
Oh, I feel the same way about that Modest Mouse song, "Float On."
Oh yeah, that sounds good.
That and Franz Ferdinand, they have that same sort of rock in digital worked really well there.
And obviously, I like how I'm not the biggest fan of the first two Interpol albums. Strangely enough, they sound good. To be fair, they sound clean, but and not like an ugly, like a loud sort of 90s. I mean, it worked for Nirvana because that was sort of abrasive, but in other contexts, it's just like sounds like ugly, sort of like edgy department store sort of idea of like early adolescent sort of edgy music. But like Stone Temple Pilots, that's just garbage anyway. To be fair, but
Surely.
Like the Omni album we talked about it on the channel before. A Souvenir, like that's proof positive, especially because that wouldn't have been nearly as expensive, even relatively, as Ferdinand. And yet that's digital production and rock. They have no tension anymore.
There's a few of those in the case of these newer post-punk bands. They do marry the sort of contemporary production to the sound quite well. I agree.
Yeah.
And also one of your later picks too, actually.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Interestingly enough.
And I believe we're now going on toward this archival release.
Yeah, we'll move on.
Right.
This one's an archival release. I think recorded in like 82, but released in 2012 or
I think
something?
it was 11.
11, okay, yeah.
Nice.
Because I would have come across this one around the time I was first getting into like minimal synth. And I think this is a minimal wave release, or you know that record label that
sure.
sort of in a weird way either repopularized it or like, you know, the minimal synth was sort of coming back around, so a label comes up and then it becomes even more popular because the label becomes popular. Like that seems to sort of be what happened in the early 2010s with minimal synth.
Yeah.
I feel.
Yeah.
And yeah, this one, I guess initially I was just intrigued by the name of the group, Crash Course in Science. Very interesting, strange sort of name, especially for like a sort of synth band, or like, you know, one of these sort of stealth science fiction sort of John Foxy synthy sort of things, you know.
DIY project, yeah.
Yeah, a bit punk as well in that sense. You know, 808 core or whatever. And this one's near Marineland. I should say A Trip to Marineville, actually. Another good album.
That's great.
But yeah, this title always reminded me of that album for some reason. But yeah, this one is just a... Yeah, I guess the first one I would have heard, it's still one of my favourites from them, is the third track, It Costs to Be Austere. There's just something so like devilishly playful, but also like very like early 80s, like, you know, punk sentiment about that as well. I just think it's a great little sort of piece for a sort of... like, you know, we were talking about earlier, those sort of like German-esque groups like DAF, you know, one of these like sort of hard synth club tracks, or like Suicide, one of those sort of things, you know. And yeah, this album is just, I just love how, for one, the drum programming is just so... There's something so interesting. Like, you know, I obviously brought up Martin DuPont. I just love like early 808 drum programming, especially in these like very hard synth sort of songs. You know, this is just like, it's like a weird combination of minimal synth and like synth funk or something. You know, or like takes little elements of those, and then yeah, a bit of like early techno as well. Like it's just a very... Like it's almost like the Motorhead of synth punk or something, you know. It's just like I don't know, all just like metal, you know, fast sort of speedy metal, but in synth form. Like there's just something very visceral and heart pounding, and yeah, I don't know. This album just gets my blood boiling, you know. It's very abrasive, but also like funky at the same time. I don't know how to describe it. It's yeah, like the hardcore punk version of Metamatic or something, you know, just taking out the pop elements.
Minimal synths, EBM.
Yeah, very EBM sort of as well, I suppose.
And American, actually.
Yeah, of all things,
From Philadelphia.
I didn't know that till the other day. I thought they were English, as you would.
I think all these groups seem to be English or European.
Or maybe New York, yeah.
Oh, true, yeah. There was obviously Suicide, but and I think there was a few other acts in that ilk.
Yeah. Like in the sort of no-wave Cynthia. A few obscure...
Oh, like the Units, for example.
The Units. Yeah.
To the point where they're almost a little more maximal at times. But I guess compared to the high-end groups, they're very minimal.
Yeah,
but like, I think... sorry, go on. Oh, Ico from Canada, for example, actually. And
Ico, yeah.
Amazing.
That's a bit more minimal.
Brilliant release.
Maximal's actually a good word, because for a minimal synth release, I find this very maximal as well. Like, there's a lot of layers of sounds going on. It's very abrasive. Like, it doesn't just rely on the same sort of galloping house beats or things like that, you know.
Yeah, maybe they had like decent studio time. I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to say because they obviously didn't release it at the time. They only had like an EP release called Songs from Pier 13, I think. And I always had a weird sort of fondness for that EP as well, because when I was a kid, I used to go fishing in a place called Pier 13.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was always like, wow, it's like they made this EP for me or something.
Interesting.
The songs from Pier 13. But yeah, anyway, in the case of this album, yeah, it's just a sort of very, like, immediate, like I said, blood-boiling sort of album for me. I just enjoy it quite a lot. So I wanted to revisit it eventually on the show, and I was like, yeah, why not now? Maybe actually because you on the last show you put on Jerry and the Hologram.
Yeah,
So I was getting in the mood for
yeah.
this sort of stuff, you know, like those 808s and stuff.
Mm.
I was like, all right, you played a Jerry and the Holograms, I'll raise you a
Crash Course in Science.
yeah, like a bit of poker or something, minimal synth poker. That'd be a fun game.
Magnificent. That'd be very good for the ears.
Mm.
Yeah, no, this is it's really, really good. And what's interesting is that it has the structure of it. Was this meant to be an album at the time, or was this more of like a comp situation? Like, do you know?
I'm not sure. I assume it's the one session because it has a sort of consistent sound.
Okay, so I wasn't sure if there was a consistent sound or whether it was
Interesting.
sort of a comp, because maybe because I was thinking of it as an archival, because obviously like the Jerry and the Holograms, like that's just a series of tracks they put together.
Yeah.
I mean, they have a flow to them, but that's just because when you have, you can put them in any order you want, so you give the comp a bit of a flow.
Yeah.
No one has any expectation because none of these tracks have been released before, so you just give it a flow because you can. Like those Patrick Cowley posthumous comps, like they have a great flow to them because people just intrinsically know. Like, okay,
I'd be curious.
We all put playlists together. You know how it is.
It's an interesting question to pose. I'd be curious to find out because I always just would have assumed it was just the one session. But yeah,
Considering it's only 38 minutes long, yeah, maybe.
Yeah, because it's comps generally, well, especially comps released in the 2010s.
Depends how much tracks they actually recorded, you know.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
But it's.
But they didn't put the EP on it, for example.
Okay, yeah, I haven't heard the EP, so yeah, I wouldn't know. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. But no, it's really good. Sounds like a lot of the really quality. There's a lot of really quality groups of this ilk, whether it's Linear Movement or I said Ico before.
Yeah.
There's a fantastic group. I think they were from New York called Dark Day, which that's a brilliant album.
Okay, that sounds interesting.
I've played Dark Day. I'm insulted. Yeah.
I'll probably recognize it, I suppose.
Okay. But like, it's good stuff, and like this whole world was just like, man, like. I think like at one time it would have sounded really modern and sort of like riveting, but I think now it sounds like, I guess there's that sort of lost future appeal. But what it is, what was really fascinating is it's almost like a bit genteel in its way, because like the technology became really sort of suffocating by the later part of this decade, seemingly the 80s.
Yeah, I assume this is pre-MIDI.
Yeah, and just like how like the technology and those sounds sort of became very sanitized and ubiquitous in all of popular music. Like synth pop itself sort of just dissolved into just mainstream pop music. You know what I mean? And R&B had all these elements in it now.
Yeah.
Divorced from say like the disco sort of funk roots.
And you couldn't tell the difference between Janet Jackson and Tiffany.
Yeah, and like it's like you hear like the Stock Aitken Waterman stuff, and it's just like. That was synth pop like 7 years ago. You know what I mean?
Right.
In its own way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Stock Aitken Waterman's a bit like that.
I don't mean them. I mean what them and what they're a part of. You know what I mean?
Yeah, they're like a reverberation on
encapsulate.
that popular, Human League song or whatever.
Don't You Want Me, Baby?
That sort of synth pop. Yeah.
Yeah. I was never. Dare to me is like the most overrated of like the 80s, like sort of electronic albums.
It's overrated for sure.
I don't care for it.
Well, funnily enough, that is the worst song on it, far and away. that song.
Maybe some other like major albums. I was never that hot on Depeche Mode. Like certainly by the Violator, I'm just not interested in what they're doing. Black Celebration's okay. The first album's good actually. I'll give them that.
Actually, what's interesting? That I forgot to mention on Pop Will Lead itself. The producer of it was some guy called Flood.
Oh, I forgot to mention something about that.
When you look at his like production credits, you're like, wow, what the hell? It's out there. Or at least like it's all that gothic like Depeche Mode industrial stuff and shit like that.
Yeah.
Weirdly enough, what were you gonna say, Sarah?
Okay, I'm just looking up Flood's credits quickly, but one of the members of this fucking band is Clint Mansell, the composer. He's the film's like Requiem for a Dream, Mass Effect 3, like that guy.
What?
Yeah.
In Crash Course in Science?
No, sorry.
In Pop Will Lead itself. Really? Okay.
Yeah, he was in it. He's the lead vocalist.
Yeah, okay.
Lead vocalist, guitarist, and one of the band's main songwriters.
And he did the music for Mass Effect.
Yeah, that was the thing. Like, I remember people like hyping that up at the time because I remember that news story breaking.
Wow!
Like, oh, Mansell's going to do Mass Effect 3. His first soundtrack was Pi. You understand?
Okay.
And then so it leads to.
Oh wow! He did because that's like a breakbeat thing. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and then obviously, it's I think his next big film was I never saw Murder by Numbers by Barbet Schroeder. That could be interesting. An Elias Merhage film. Well, he has the Begotten director, but he got a little bit more conventional later on.
That guy got conventional?
Somewhat. He did a film that was like the behind the scenes of Nosferatu called Shadow of the Vampire. It's sort of like in both worlds. Like it's, for a Hollywood film, it's fairly gothic and interesting. But it's it's an Ian McKellen starring. Not Ian McKellen. John Malkovich. Yeah, I could be wrong.
I think I had that at my house when I was a kid on DVD or something.
Oh yeah, nice. Yeah. Well, that was only the second feature he ever directed, actually.
Okay.
After Begotten. I mean, there's a couple of short sequels or like symbolic sequels to Begotten, but they're not features. One came out in like the early 2010s, I believe. Shadow of the Vampire. Anyway,
for a second I thought Crash Course in Science was the
Shadow of the Vampire wasn't apparently was independent. I mean, distributed by Lionsgate, but still, it says it's independent on the wiki anyway. But yeah, I guess I was just But yeah, Clint Mansell. He did Sahara, and remember that from 2005, and the Doom film. Oh, and of course other Aronofsky Doom.
Yeah, Doom.
Yeah, that one. The Aronofsky film The Fountain. Remember that film Smoking Aces, and then Aronofsky's The Wrestler, Duncan Jones' Moon. That film's not very good. Black Swan by Aronofsky.
Oh, Moon! I forgot that was a movie.
Stoker by
Duncan Jones.
Yeah, David Bowie.
Yeah, David Bowie's son.
Yeah, David Bowie, who also did Source Code and Warcraft. I think those are his only films. None of them are very good, sadly.
Yeah.
I haven't seen Warcraft. I just assume I wouldn't like it.
Yeah, Moon's like baby's first like psychological thriller.
The guy also scored Park Chan-wook's Stoker. I talked about a lot of Park Chan-wook's films recently, and this is just more an FOTD sort of tangent. And we skipped Stoker, as some of you, if you follow FOTD, would have noticed. And I think I had a few brief words on Stoker. At the time, Stoker from 2013, Park Chan-wook, famous South Korean director of Oldboy, and some other interesting films. Stoker was his first English language film, starred Nicole Kidman and a couple other people. Who was the other? Mia, that other lady, Australian girl, Mia Wasikowska. She's a nice girl. She's a decent actress. But like at the time we sort of thought Stoker was a little bit subpar, and then 2013 and some people were like, oh no, it's secretly genius, but they were just grasping at straws. Like Stoker seemed like a rarely subpar effort from Park Chan-wook. In retrospect, like Stoker really is one of the worst films ever made. Like there's really no getting around it. Like it's abominable. And I wish Noel Oakeshott were here, so I'm sure he would agree.
I gotta watch this movie.
Oh, it's just so fucking vacuous. It's just there's nothing fucking like you've lost the plot. Fucking like just like vapidly elitist, but not even in an interesting way elitist. You know what I mean? Like, it's just so divorced from anything. It's just oh man, and like obviously it goes without saying, but like it's just not a very. I just hate to say it sounds rude to say, but it's not a very well performed film, and I think that I think there's a language barrier here which does not fucking work.
Right.
It's not quite Ang Lee's Sense. Ang Lee's Sense and Sensibility work. This don't work. That's a horrible thing to say, but whatever. Like, just shut my channel down. I don't care. Fuck it. I do care, but like, I'll deal with it. Aronofsky's Noah, Ben Wheatley's High Rise. I've talked about that in the channel before. That live action Ghost in the Shell film. Oh God.
Oh wow.
Duncan Jones did a film called Mute in 2018. I guess I didn't see that one. Oh, it's got it's like a cyberpunk looking, techno-art looking thing. I'm sure it's crap. It's fucking whatever. Anyway, that's Clint Mansell. I really like this album. Anything else you got to say about it?
No, it's just I think the best thing I could say is it makes my blood boil. It's the heart races.
And I guess I'll move on to I was mentioning before how cool like the productions could be really cool in the 2000s.
Daft Punk is playing at my house.
Yeah, LCD sound system, but then sort of like dance punk outfits or dance sort of new wave outfits. And we're talking.
I was thinking when listening. I'm glad you picked this one. I'm like, this is a genre I haven't explored enough. I always wanted to like the band Atari Teenage Riot or whatever they're called, just because of the name. But I don't like the music. I got to explore more new wave.
Okay, I don't know Atari Teenage Riot as well. But no, with this act, I'd seen the album cover around a while. I think it was on Best Ever Albums. I may have even heard it back in late high school and liked it okay, but not enough.
Nice.
But I'm throw it again in the list now, and I'm looking for 2000 stuff, and I listened to it.
Were they big? Because
I don't know if they were.
Because judging from the amount of
this is their only album.
Yeah, I saw it was their only album, and it didn't seem like it had heaps of. I was like, this is like relatively obscure, I suppose.
Like it's
How many ratings does it have? For
I'll
example?
check. Hold on. Ratings 2,900.
Yeah, so about
Just
Close
under 300,
Lobster's level.
Just under
of,
3,000. Oh, okay.
so, you know, not that big, but
Yeah.
not unknown. It's in the weird Goldilocks zone.
Yeah. That's the Wikipedia article's not enormous. So I'm assuming they're not a huge band. And they broke up in 2010 as well, so there's probably not going to be any more albums unless they get
Yeah.
This is the sort of music that lends themselves to people, and they're like.
And it might be
20s.
hard for them to do a better album as well. Like, it'd be hard to top this one.
It's really, really good. No, the production's on point. The songs are on point. It's like immediately catchy, and it's got a really evocative soundscape. This is like the Echo and the Bunnymen of its era. In a way.
Interesting.
I say that because of how seriously they took the sonic landscapes of what they were doing.
For sure.
And I say that's rather than soundscapes because there was real like environment evocation on Echo and the Bunnymen, especially on albums 3 and 4.
Yeah.
But even I think to some degree on Heaven Up Here.
Yeah.
Crocodiles maybe is a bit more straightforward post-punk.
That's more stripped back. That's the most.
Poppy.
But and poppy, yeah. But I mean, like the guitar, it's just like drum and wires guitar and shit like that, you know.
Yeah. But like it's just such a evocative, beautiful thing, fantasy black channel. It makes you like this is kind of like if you were young. I mean, I was 12 when this album came out, and I didn't hear it at the time, obviously. But if I'd been like 17 to 21 when this came out, it would have been like fuck yeah, my generation's on point.
Yeah,
Even if this wasn't the biggest band in the world, it's nice to know that there is like a vessel out there.
Yes.
And you listen to it now, and it's like the 2000s had a fantastic sound at times, and it's a shame that a lot of this stuff seemed to dissipate during the 2010s. And it's the same sort of problem, which I'll say is the reason why a group like Animal Collective may have suffered a bit. Well, I guess Centipede HZ is probably just their own fault. Like, I don't even know where that came from, sloppiness. But
Writer's block, maybe. I don't know.
yeah, after 2 major classics, it can happen. But the thing is, it's like, I feel like a lot of people in the 2010s were... I might be incorrect, but how it always came across to me, I think people were a bit stifled by the existence of social media, so they were being a bit more safe. And I don't mean in terms of, like, trying to pander to, like, I mean more in terms of, like, you can get... The critic, everyone's a critic now, it's not just the magazines they're worrying about, like, it's everything. And so I feel like it stifled people a little bit. There was a lot less who gives a fuck going on when... In hip-hop, you saw a little bit of, like, that people just not giving a fuck going on. And the critics seemed to like that stuff, to be fair, so it worked out for them. Money-wise, I don't know. They were never as rich as some of the other more sort of dumbed-down acts, to be fair. But, like, I just feel like this sort of music seemed to... A lot of creative, interesting sounds. Like, there's some, like, I was criticizing the 2010s in the last Mandala, and I found, from a cursory glance, it does feel that way, because even when I look at the most acclaimed music of the 2010s compared to other decades, including the 2000s, it's not... Or now's, 2010 and 20s, the 2010s is not very impressive.
Well,
and I just wish there was
still
more brazen creativity.
It hasn't been curated as deep yet.
That's true, but that's why it's important to bring up the 2020s, because I think the stuff coming out now is way better than the stuff that was coming out even in the later part of the 2010s.
You know what? I do agree with that. But particularly, there was a big burst of musical creativity during COVID.
There was.
It was a phenomenon.
Well,
I think at this
would
point
we have gotten Cities of Eve's album without lockdown? Possibly not.
No, there's maybe.
Well, I'd have to look up when
off
that
the
was
top of
recorded.
my head. Now that you mention it, there's probably like 14 albums I could think of that
Idris Ackamore, Charlie XCX is a lockdown album.
all come out of lockout, right? Yeah, it was
Acid Mammoth.
I think we're enough
Definitely,
years
yeah,
removed
right.
from that now to sort of look back and see it as a phenomenon for what it was.
Boldy James.
Whereas, like, yeah, that's true. Maybe the 2010s was perhaps a bit weaker, but maybe there's plenty of stuff.
Toward the end of the decade, things are heating up. Like, Injury Reserve pops out in 2019, and that's sort of like a shape of things to come moment.
And it's just one example, but I wonder how many, like, Energy 2000s there are out there, that are just, like, 100 subscribers, but, still yet to be because I feel that way about like certain, like I brought up even Crash Course, though they did curate that in the 2010s, so the 80s has been covered a bit better, you know.
Yeah.
But I feel that way about the 90s to some degree, the 2000s
Yeah.
to a similar degree, maybe a bit more in a way because it is more recent, and perhaps more with the 2010s. Though yeah, it's interesting. Maybe there was a bit of a lull, especially in like popular music, because I, you know, personally not a fan of the sort of popular EDM of the early 2010s. That was a pretty bad era for pop.
Yeah.
That was like a late 80s.
Unless it's funneled into Machine Girl, I guess, but they were whack.
But that's not pop. 80s.
Oh, I hear what you mean. Sorry.
That's actual.
Yeah.
You know,
that pop distinction's important.
Yeah. Well,
I love that. I love what you just said there. Actual club.
Yeah. I'm talking about David Guetta and
Yeah,
Steve Aoki and you know, all downstream of like mid 2000s French, like Benny Benassi House, that sort of stuff. That then became Swedish House Mafia and. I forget the guy's name. There was another French guy who was popular in the early 2010s. You know, he had a song where it was like, I say hello, do 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 do. You know, his name was like Martin something.
Okay.
Yeah. There was a bunch of that crap. It was an awful time for popular music.
Yeah.
Generally. So perhaps that's... It was a bit of a late 80s moment. Whereas, something like this, man. You know what? Actually, I'm glad you brought up like landscapes. I want to. I'll give this a listen with headphones as well because it'll probably be great. But as a speaker listen, it was also really good, especially like walking around.
Oh, I can imagine.
The thing I think I was most impressed about the album was that it had such a variety in songwriting style. But at the same time, it wasn't like, say, something like a white album example, you know?
No.
It had that consistent sound throughout it.
Yeah, it all made sense.
And, like, I've only listened to the album once.
Nothing felt like a deviation.
I want to listen to it again, but as I was listening to it, I could hear all the... Like, each song came from a different place of influence, you know?
Mm.
Like, the first song was more of its era, I remember. Like, it was sort of like a... Almost like a Wolf Parade, but done in a less, like... ghosty production and a more direct sort of thing, you know.
Yeah.
And then there was a bit of LCD sound system, like I said earlier. But I want to listen to this album again because it went into very strange sort of subgenre of indie rock and dance, indie punk sort of territories, you know.
Yeah.
It sort of it almost was like a curator album with its like sensibilities, you know.
Mm.
But at the same time kept a consistent flow and sonic place, you know. It had a very distinct sound. Like the sound didn't change, but all the stylings around it did.
You know what it does, which most curator rock / pop doesn't do, or like kind of is a difficult time doing because they're being very particular. Well, I'm essentially going to say a synonym for that.
Yeah,
immediacy.
Yeah, sure.
Like a lot of this like curator stuff can lack immediacy. I feel
sure.
Not always, but like that's just sort of when they're trying so difficult to like sort of manicure the past and like do something that they can like sort of put on the wall and be proud of. They're sort of forgetting like. But is it actually making you like jump? This does thoroughly. It's one of the better sort of mainstream albums in the 2000s. I mean, not that it was a new mainstream, something that could be considered within the mainstream palette at least.
Yeah,
right? Yeah,
and interesting percussions. Well, because it was very melodic, but yeah, where it'll become more in the vein of like art indie was. You know, it's sort of tapestry, reverberating sounds all around the main pop song structure,
yeah.
You know?
When I say mainstream, you could have played it in 2008 at a gathering and no one would bat an eye at it. No one would be like, it was abrasive.
You could
like
put it in a
like
playlist between...
It would sound very, very modern and people would be like, yeah, cool.
You put it in a playlist between the Libertines and Kaiser Chiefs, you know?
Yeah, people would enjoy it as far as I have no reason to suspect they wouldn't at least. No, I don't think, yeah. But really good stuff. I mean, it just makes me because I think I always love the sound of. As I was saying about Franz Ferdinand before, love the sound. Don't like the songs so much. The songs are a bit just sort of bland and there. You know what I mean? They're just sort of predictable and sort of samey.
Yeah,
sort of not very exciting to me. Take Me Out's okay, but again, it's just one riff, sort of just that's alright.
Yeah.
But I always wanted more from these groups, and I mentioned Interpol earlier. I loved where Interpol went on the third album onwards.
Mm.
Our Love to Admire onwards, like Our Love to Admire is easily the best one, but the ones afterward are quite good too. They're a bit samey, but like I'm just a sucker for that sort of tight, poppy, but like very considerate and sort of like tastefully produced sort of post-punk stuff. It's just like I'm a sucker for disco, I'm a sucker for that, I'm a sucker for like really slick and passionate cheesy 70s prog, but not the neo-prog stuff. That gets too... Prog's something that has a hard time working outside of its original production context, I feel. Maybe the 80s it was still okay, just because like some of that stuff sounds alright still.
Well, it goes in a different...
Prog and digital is in a weird... how jazz and digital don't always mesh.
We'll get there.
Prog without the analog synths.
Prog does
and
go...
keyboards.
It does work in digital, but it's a different sort of permutation.
Oh, yeah, that's a different sort of prog, though.
Which we'll get to with your last pick.
That's a different world.
It's not prog rock or symphonic prog.
Yeah,
but
it's derived from it, but it has a lot to do with, like math rock and sort of very technical fusion styles.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
But
anyway, this album, it's I like the second I started, I'm like, I had a feeling it was going to be really good, and it was. Like you said, immediate, very immediate for sure. Yeah, I want to hear it again just to remember where all the places it was coming from. Good first day listen.
Hell yeah. Now shall we move on to this local act?
Yeah, the next one
Negative
we got Negative Gears, named after, I assume...
phenomenon of negative gearing.
Yeah, that weird sort of
One of the
topical...
biggest talking points in the 2020s.
Bloody Australian politics. And, the album is called Moralizer. I would have heard this band, they had like an EP before from like 2019 or something. And I thought that was alright, but a bit more sort of... I'd have to listen to it again, but it felt a bit more on the nose.
How'd you come across them?
My brother.
Okay, yeah, I was going to ask, yeah.
And the way I heard this album was, I would have sent him a review I wrote for the Amel and the Sniffers. Like, just something about, like, pseudo-Australian hardcore really rubs me the wrong way. And I pointed out that, like, if you really wanted to, like, just dig below the surface of the Australian hardcore scene, you can find 50 awesome bands that are way better.
Yeah.
And my brother sent me this. He was like, "Oh, did I send you this album when it came out?" And I was like, "Oh, no, because it's just a few months old, I suppose." Yeah. And like straight away, I'm like, "Yeah, see, this is what I want, like that sort of stuff to be. Like it is punk in like the various ways we've talked about the sort of distinction between like authenticity and posturing or whatever. And something like this is it's proper like I mentioned, the name of the band and even Moralizer, it comes from a real place of like this sort of like middle class, like Australian sort of middle, like it's not a working class thing, and it doesn't have that sort of, it's not like posery in the sense of like Australians trying to do oi, but in the bogan context. Like these people feel like they're authentically like coming where they're from, and within the context of this sort of like drum machine, hardcore, sort of synthy stuff, they're just writing songs about their situation and the reality of living in like a contemporary sort of beige city, similar to like Sydney or Vancouver, or I'm sure there's plenty of world cities that are, especially in the like sort of imported Anglosphere, where the sort of European culture was imported over and is more like I mentioned, Canada or Australia or America.
Auckland?
New Zealand, yeah. They not really in the case of New Zealand. They're not developed yet. They're still 100 years behind.
Still hobbits.
Where like there's this sort of not import, like exported from like Anglo sort of culture that just expanded so quick from capitalist like progression, right? This sort of, it's all encapsulated with the manifest destiny, the American mythology thing. Let's just spread out west, right? And so these sort of places like Sydney, apparently Vancouver, and apparently places in America just have that sort of feeling of sprawl and like emptiness, and there's a weird like cultural disconnect people feel because of sort of self-imposed isolation. Well, not even necessarily self-imposed, but like a sort of collective like distrust of neighbors and things like that, right? And an album like this just it really does remind me of where we're in now in like our historical moment, and the context of, say, Sydney is so similar in many ways to where that first sort of punk and post-punk spewed out of 70s England, and even parts of like the hardcore movement in America. Like we are sort of like quantumly entangled to that moment still, in a way, I feel.
Those sort of albums never really stopped coming out, did they? They come out all through the 90s, they're all through the 2000s, these sort of albums exist.
Australian ones as well, yeah.
Oh, that's true, yeah, especially.
It's sort of one of our things in a weird way.
But there's always like American and UK albums of that ilk, right from like the post-punk scene, like they here and there, but and they were never, sometimes they were more, you know, commercially, you know, successful than others, but, you know, like, well, people don't find out about them 2 years later, but like they're always there. It's like, you know, the Brian Jonestown Massacre world in the 90s, or you know,
sure.
in the 2000s. There's like all these like sort of like old indie bands in like, you know, because some of those are very popular, and so naturally there's like more underground scenes trying to do their thing, and especially in Sydney, there's heaps of it.
Yeah. In a place like Sydney, where you're not going to get...
to be fair.
And Melbourne, Australia more generally, because Perth had the same, Brisbane to a lesser degree. Well, Perth, because that's also even more isolated from Australia itself, so that had a strange permutation. Brisbane to a lesser degree, because Queensland's a bit warped, but...
oh, hell yeah.
Well, it's tropical heat. The equator...
Yeah, it's not your fault.
That close to the equator, but, you know, above the Tropic of Capricorn will do that to you. Yeah. I was thoroughly impressed with this album. I really do sort of... It's a pity that these people just exist as like a sort of small but and very like vague cultish sort of thing, as opposed to like that fake music industry machine pseudo-punk sort of thing. But I'm glad the authentic thing exists. Like it is the real meal, you know. I really like this album, especially like I forget it. It's like the second or third song, and then one of the last song, Pills. Those are like very contemporary anthems. They're great.
I guess I'll get into my own thoughts. I thought it's very good. It's like, you know, it's hardcore, but not trying too hard. Just sort of like organic, and just like it likes the hardcore mold, and it's sort of like flexing within that, but not necessarily like, you know, trying to be the most abrasive, like, fuck you, grandma, like, like, you know, like,
fuck you, grandma,
you know,
that's
like,
hilarious.
It's just like, it's just tasteful and organic, and sort of just like, bam, there's just like Psyche on the disc, you know. And it's fun and creative. Like, it's not the most ambitious sort of work in the history of this sort of continuum. But like, it doesn't have to be, and like, if it tried to be more so, it kind of would have like hurt it, you know what I mean?
That would hurt it, yeah.
Like, sometimes you just need like a good, like sometimes a pop track comes along and it's not the most original thing you ever heard. Like, take Imaginal Disc, Magdalena Bay has the third song on their Image, one of the most brilliant little pop songs you hear in the year. But isn't that dissimilar from Kylie Minogue / Sophie Ellis-Bextor / Moloko Turn of the Millennium?
Sure.
Not really, but that's why I like it. Plus the modern production, sort of the subtle little changes that they wouldn't have committed to at the time.
I think the song,
on the street,
if it's the song I'm thinking of, it could even be like,
oh my god.
Yeah. Yeah, that was the one I'm thinking of. Yeah, no, that's very like 2010s, like Lady Gaga, even when she tries to get more artsy.
Yeah, but her songs are never that catchy.
Yeah, but I mean, in that vein, like a Lana Del Rey, that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, but again, like, I never found those songs catchy at all.
Well, neither do I, but that's what I mean. It's fitting into that world of like more middle of the road pop, but doing it with a sort of a better sensibility. Like, I feel that way about, remember that album, that Secession album? That's how I feel about like that, you know?
Which album?
Secession.
Oh, of course, that's a good one. Yeah.
That album sort of is.
It's derivative, but it's so much fun.
It's sort of how I feel about it.
So it is creative within its parameters, but not like revolutionary.
It's like the 80s version of that Magdalena Bay album in a way, you know.
I don't know, Magdalena Bay, like that album is very densely and like richly produced in a way that like feels like the 2010s just simply wasn't capable of yet for the most part, or wasn't willing to go there in such a bold manner. Maybe
that's true.
Maybe like now Death Dynamic Shroud is approaching that place a little bit too, but like it seems like something, but there's this art pop thing which mostly DIY artists sort of committing to than mainstream acts.
I think
Maybe there's
the
something
thing that
I'm
sets it
thinking of.
apart from that is like
Spelling's a little more mainstream. That was a good work production wise actually.
the Magdalena Bay does like
obviously.
post like trap production things. You know how like
Yeah.
things that were innovated through like trap and 2010s hip hop production.
Yeah,
sort
like
of-
bizarre drum patterns.
they've all bled into other forms of music.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I think that's what that is doing, which wouldn't have been in the 2010s in its case.
Yeah.
It would have been a bit more housey or something, you know.
Don't hip hop drum beats pre-trap sound a bit samey now that we're here in this 2024? You know what I mean? Like,
Oh,
it's amazing how even in the
they were
not
always-
everything in the 2000s, but you realize how like similar the drum beats were. Like, there wasn't a hell of a lot of variety because I guess people weren't.
Yeah.
There wasn't a lot. I don't know. It was really
Well, it wasn't until the
like-
2000s where you got a bit more variety.
Yeah, you think of stuff like Dalek,
80s and 90s is like, you know, from
Doom, I guess.
from Silver Age, it's all that, you know, same drum machine pattern essentially, which
Yeah.
you know,
the
pop
boom, what
itself-
they call boom bap.
the boomy sort of stuff. Well, and then in the 90s you get the backpacker boom bap, which is all the, you know, post James Brown sample where you just get something a bit more obscure slightly. Or,
Yeah.
And it's all very similar, like
Yes.
breakbeat. And the thing that innovated further from that was things like D&B and stuff, you know, which then took that to the next level.
Totally, yeah.
Whereas the sort of hip hop beat sort of became a bit stale for a bit.
Yeah.
I agree. And I guess the next big innovation was like Timbaland, sort of that like heavy R&B synth, late 90s like thing that came
Yeah,
along.
culminates in like the Jay-Z sound / then the Kanye West sort of.
Yeah.
The Jay-Z sound is Kanye West sound, to be fair, I guess, literally, before College Dropout came out. But on to negative gears, I guess. It's really good little work. Again, like you just kind of enjoy that there's something that's sort of in this punk ilk, just existing, being itself, like relatively unique, but not necessarily quite a revelation creatively, but really good and gratifying. Because I don't have any major. I'm very happy it exists. You know.
Yeah.
Totally.
Me too, yeah. I agree. Like I said, I just wrote that in the review, assuming that, you know, when you dig under the surface, there's 50 bands, and sure enough, there is.
Yeah.
So, if anyone listens to Amel and the Sniffers,
You're not welcome on this channel.
well, just Google something else. Just look something
Well,
else
yeah,
up.
well, yeah, I guess that's a nicer alternative. But if you listen to FOTD recently, you know how AD's gone lately.
Yeah, Violent Soho and the DMAs for life.
Whoa, what the fuck? That all what's been going on.
I'm just pointing out other pseudo indie Australian bands, you know what I mean?
Oh, fair enough.
These are the ones that, you know, they sort of muddy the waters of the more actual ones.
They do. Anyway, speaking of these sort of like punk continuum sort of bands from all across the globe, we're going to go to Spain. This particular act is
I was wondering where this was from.
Berry Zarak,
I was
and they were
wondering if
formed
it
in
was Polish
'94.
again.
No, this isn't Polish. But like we've talked about a Spanish sort of band on this continuum, Viva Belgrado. We talked about the 2024 album recently. Oh, not recently, like some months ago now. And now I came across this just because, again, like most of these, I just see the cover art. And
This has a good cover. The
Yeah, and initially I thought it was going to be like some sort of wonky EDM thing. And then
Yeah,
I posted
me
on the
too.
thing, I'm just like, oh, post-hardcore. Oh, well, I like Viva Belgrade, like, and that this may be like an early version of that sort of thing.
Is this also classified as melodic hardcore?
Yeah, not in bold, but yeah.
Yeah, I knew it. I love it, man. This is a great melodic hardcore album.
So Viva Belgrado is maybe a bit more on the acoustic guitars. It could sound a bit like, you know, slowcore or like Midwest emo at times.
Or like the outro on the last song, or the second last song, I can't remember, where it goes into the clean acoustic. It was exactly the same as like it was very similar to a hum song.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so that sort of
Yeah.
thing.
But this one's a bit more on the distortion end than Viva
Oh,
Belgrado.
yeah.
And it's very much like a turn of the millennium / early 2000s band of this ilk.
What
But-
year was the album?
2003.
Okay.
But the problem is, like, a lot of those bands especially the more mainstream ones in the English language world, they're very corny and like, the productions, they're overproduced and they're just like uncreative and they're acting like music history's only lasted for like 5 fucking years or something.
Yeah.
And it's just really annoying. Whereas, like, sung in Spanish, it's very beautiful. Wow, Spanish might lend itself to this genre more so as a language.
Sure.
Well, this particular era of the genre, I should say.
Yeah.
When it was like very sort of poppy, wanted to be poppy and melodic in
it's
that
got the
pop punk way.
pop punk thing going.
But
yeah.
but it also wanted to be like
'Cause-
abrasive for the like edgier teenagers too, and the English language stuff was pathetic.
That's what
but this is
melodic-
kind of working.
That's what melodic hardcore.
Oh,
is.
sure, okay,
yeah, and because like
That's interesting.
the sort of pop melodies you get on this, like are reminiscent of that band Millencolin of all bands.
Okay, I never listened to them too.
They're not very
People
good.
would have played them for me, I'm sure, at one time maybe.
They're like a
Late high
Swedish
school.
band or something,
Oh.
like in the late '90s skate punk, pop punk era. So it's like that sort of like sugar coated melodies, but somehow works with like the key to this group like was good songwriting chops for one thing, but it was the way they were able to sort of mix those candy coated melodies, and like you said, it probably helps that it's in Spanish. As a non-Spanish speaker, I don't know what the lyrics are, but the melodies were and the phonetics of the language were like, quite beautiful. But then the breakdowns, like this band had such an ear for like the breakdowns are great on this album. Man, if you're a fan of breakdown core or like anything like that, give this one a listen because they do it like it's not like mind blowing breakdowns or anything. It's done within the parameters of like melodic hardcore pop punk sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Easy core or whatever they called it. But it's not. You don't want to throw up listening to it. It actually sounds good, you know.
Mm. Yeah, like it's just such a interesting sort of vivid listen, and like it's just I don't know. I guess I wish, and like even musically, it seems like it's like more interesting and convicted. You know what it is? Maybe in a nation like Spain, like they grew up on like Spanish traditional music, and like they hear like it's just in their sort of cultural lexicon, and they sort of like to them they sort of see the bridge between those two things in a way that like Americans have like a 5-year timeline. You know what I mean? At any given time. Of extremely short memory, whereas like, the cultural memory of Spain is extraordinary. You know what I mean? Or a lot of countries, or any country in continental Europe, really.
And
or most countries other than America, to be fair. 'Cause
Especially
it's a very young
Spain as
nation.
well. Yeah.
If you think of like that great Spanish sort of like it's like on Viva Belgrado, it's even more defined, arguably, how that sort of gorgeous like tradition of like some Spanish troubadour kind of molds into the sort of Midwest sort of what's known as an American Midwest sort of like post-hardcore sort of like depressive sort of release catharsis sound, and that album in particular is because I heard their other albums and they didn't seem as interesting to me, like sort of just like albums in a scene sort of records, not overly ambitious, but like the last album, the 2024 album, its title's also in Spanish. I don't necessarily remember it off the top of my head. It's one of these things where it's like it's just like pure world music. You know what I mean? It's like genre classifications are irrelevant to something like that. Maybe this is how we feel because we're hearing it because we don't understand the words, so it just sounds like Spanish music.
Yeah.
But like the fact that it's falling into post-hardcore / slowcore is irrelevant. But obviously in this case, it is closer to a sort of like vague subgenre / subculture release, but even still it's such it makes you forget that this was like in the English world so just like some corporate vaguely hack sort of phenomenon that they were trying to like push as many bands out in a short period of time and make as much money as possible. More like an authentic like genuine sort of like interesting sort of cathartic scene sound. And I never really thought of this era as like sort of alt / like sort of that be the trends of punk at this time to be, especially in a more mainstream context, to be that. But so this is like the first, like it's like I can imagine being a teenager when these bands were coming out in the English speaking world. I would have felt alienated by them, even though like I kind of like the idea of having a band to enjoy as part of a zeitgeist. You know what I mean?
Sure.
This is that band for that zeitgeist to me, though it's in Spanish, but that's probably a lot. That's why it's more enjoyable for me.
I was thinking that when I was listening to this, because like in a similar description, like the first gig I ever went to was like that band Title Fight.
Okay.
Like the melodic hardcore Pennsylvania band from like the early 2010s or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm like, man, I wish like I knew of this album when I was like really into that sort of stuff, because this would like slot in there so well, you know, right in there. It was a great release.
Yeah, I was very happy to find this and just wanted to champion, because it just seemed like when I was, fit fit the mold of what I wanted to sort of, just of a quality 2000s release. It was really sort of compelling and sort of brought out the qualities of that time in a really interesting way, and sort of like, rather than, there are traits of each decade, inevitably, and so sometimes it's really, really artistically invigorating to hear stuff that employs tropes of that time in a manner that you can embrace, rather than just be like, oh, this is cliche, I'm glad we don't do this anymore, sort of thing. It makes you sort of like, there was something to this.
2003, this album was actually kind of innovative, actually, in a way. Like, I'm sure there's, like, more melodic post-hardcore prior to this, but nothing quite as interesting sonically, and, like, in a way, it seems to be where the genre went further,
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to say.
Away from the pop-punk direction and further into, like, more hardcore.
That stuff sort of wasn't as commercially viable as stuff that was more popular in 2003. But, Title Fight was very big for what it was.
Well, yeah, all that stuff's sort of indie, but I assume this would have been as well. Like, this wouldn't have been, like, Newfound Glory or, like, that sort of pop-punk from 2000.
No, yeah, I'm talking about the English language stuff around that time.
Yeah.
Which is the bands you mentioned.
Yeah, that sort of stuff, Or Thursday, or what's the emo one with I forget, the terrible Burt McCracken or whatever.
Okay.
That's the guy's name. Awful band. If someone knows, they know,
Yeah.
It's terrible. Bad time for pop-punk. The only good time for pop-punk was Milo Goes to College, to be perfectly honest.
That's a pretty good album.
Yeah, and it's not even quite pop-punk. Like, it's just hardcore with pop tent. That might be the first melodic hardcore album, actually. That or, like, Rites of Spring or something like that, The sort of Fugazi strain of post-hardcore.
Yeah, I found the Fugazi sound a bit flat.
It depends, yeah. They're not great. They're not great with... They are, at, like, basement dub production sort of stuff, That's when they're doing good work. When it's dubbier. When they're trying to be more hardcore, it's a bit, like you said, flat. Or at least it doesn't quite... Like, sometimes they try to be funky with the bass.
Is that kind of in the middle period? Because I don't know the middle period albums very well. I know Repeater and the last album, and I don't...
Yeah,
both of them are just very cold to me, but not in a very interesting way either.
Repeater's more like a melodic hardcore sort of thing. Less like... Yeah, that's more like this sort of thing, in a way. Whereas, in the dubby period's like the mid to late 90s.
Okay, because I haven't really heard the Red Medicine end hits. I'm not familiar with
end hits, the instruments.
I like the film instrument and the soundtracks here, so maybe I'll check that out.
Yeah,
that's quite a good picture from Jem Cohen.
That's like their White Album. It's weird. Like, it's just a comp sort of thing. It's not like a piece or anything. It's all just weird songs. Yeah. And strange dubby. It's like Swell Maps mixed with This Heat, It's that sort of
Love
thing.
This Heat. Yeah.
It's just not quite as good as those, but it is quite
not
good.
Many people are.
But
his name was Epic Soundtracks in 1979.
Yeah,
that's something like a crazy hip hop artist would do in the 2010s. Like, he was so ahead of his time.
Yeah. Oh man, there should have been a 2010s hip hop album called Epic Soundtracks and Spiral Staircase.
Yeah, that was the other guy's name, right? Spiral
that was
Staircase.
Pavement.
Oh, Pavement.
Yeah, the guitarist.
Yeah, so that's Swell Maps. Like, it was the brothers. And the Godfrey brothers, Epic Soundtracks, and Nicky Sudden, aka Kevin Godfrey,
Nicky Sudden,
Godfrey, but also Jiao Head, whose real name was Stephen Bird, Biggles Brooks, whose real name was Richard Earl Scaldwell, Phonesby Sportsman, real name David Barrington, and Golden Cockrill, real name John Cockrill. Anyway, that's the Swell Maps cast.
The later Fugazi album that people seem to like, or fans, it seems to be like a mild fan favourite that I actually never heard, is the last one from like 2001.
That's the one I said, Repeater and The Argument.
The Argument, yeah. Sorry, I thought you said End Hits. Oh no, sorry, you said The Argument before the middle period. Yeah, okay. I've never actually... I think I listened to the first song of The Argument once and I was just like, nah, I don't want to listen to this.
I don't know, I just found it sound cold and sort of...
Yeah, no, I don't think that's one of their better ones.
It's not that interesting,
It seems weird
we know the world is depressing. To do something interesting with it is sort of like, to make the depression aesthetic is kind of an impressive thing when Joy Division and The Cure do it back in the day. But
Yeah,
or when
no.
Nirvana do it in the early '90s, like it's not impossible, and I'm totally welcome to it.
The argument's not a good example of Fugazi, but it seems to be a fan favorite. Weirdly enough, yeah,
It's like the best rated thing they have here.
Is it?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, because I was going through an RYM list recently of Mewcore, and there's like heaps of shit in there. Heaps, but like that was one of them, and I'm like, really? That's like a Mewcore
I'm sure
album?
there's heaps of shit in there.
Oh, plenty, yeah. I rated quite a few things bad, but more things good, because a lot of it was just...
Don Caballero is very good. Is that Mewcore?
What's that?
Don Caballero, speaking of math rock, that was earlier we spoke of math rock.
Oh, that might have been. Like I said, there was like...
Because that's a really good math rock.
There was like about
It's
1,000
not-
or
a lot of
more
people
things
think
in there,
it's-
so I don't remember everything, but
Oh,
there was quite a lot,
yeah, fair enough, yeah.
It was essentially just like Pitchfork rated stuff, and then like avant-garde stuff, and then the classics or whatever. And it was just what you'd expect from like music nerd sort of music, To be fair, most of it was pretty good, but
Sure.
just like, I don't know. I see like Mazzy Star there, and I'm like, Or
Like
the
my exposure to
Sundays.
Mazzy Star, I thought they were kind of good and fun, like a bit basic, but like
yeah,
I haven't done a deep dive. Don't get me wrong.
That's just a particular thing. I'm just like,
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah,
And I like that band, The Sunday. I brought it up a bunch of times now, but that one's a bit better. But I don't know why those are the two bands.
which band? Sorry,
The Sundays and Mazzy Star.
I don't think I know the Sundays.
They're the two like twee pop female bands that like RYM love so much, but they're like my two least favorite of that whole movement.
Oh.
For some reason,
Yeah.
they're just not that interesting. I don't know.
That's what it is, I guess.
I haven't heard the first Mazzy Star album though, and that's apparently in Kurt Cobain's like top 50 list.
Oh, interesting.
So maybe that's a bit better.
Just gonna ask. Do you want to move on to?
Yeah, no, I digress. We'll move on to I suppose my last pick, the Chai Lights. For God's sake, parenthesis. Give more power to the people. Probably one of my favorite album titles of all time. Yeah, man. There's something about like I would have brought it up with the like the Roots thing, the Curtis Mayfield album, and a few other things. There's just something about like the like psychedelic soul era, or like the marrying of like civil rights sentiment and like hippiedom that for some reason is just such a like a beautiful aesthetic in the like sort of more AM pop sort of sense, It's like just this very like breezy sort of like the best aspects of like 70s breezy production, And I think this album is from like 1970.
71. Sorry.
71. Okay, yeah. It's probably one of the best like middle of the road albums I've ever heard in a way. Like it's a combination of just like basic contemporary pop of its time, but also like interesting kind of off kilter, almost like home production, Smiley Smile-esque, like maximal, vaguely psychedelic sort of production touches. And yeah, I just find a combination of that with the prevailing just sort of, like deep, soulful, like melodic tendencies of this album just speak to me in a sort of very sort of particular way. In the way that like this sort of psychedelic soul music, I kind of really grown to appreciate. Like it feels like a sort of universal music in a way,
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just like 30 or so minutes long with a bunch of killer tracks. I guess I would have first come across the album just by hearing the biggest song off it is just a pop track called Have You Seen Her?
Yeah.
And that's just like this beautiful, like best example of breezy sort of 70s. Like, I don't know. I've never really been into that. When I talk about breezy 70s music, things like Fleetwood Mac Rumours is probably the biggest, the most popular example of that sort of stuff, right? Whereas, like, to me, that just feels a bit corporate in a way, where something like this just feels like it's coming from, like, the soul, You listen to it and you feel like you maybe even know these people in a way. The weird case is, though, this album does have a couple funk songs. They're okay. I kind of dig them. But they're sort of a bit derivative of, like, Sly and the Family Stone, you know. Everything sounds a bit like Dance to the Music after that, right? In a way. Or, like, early Parliament Funkadelic sort of stuff.
The version I heard of this included a cover of I Heard It Through the Grapevine, which is not on the original track listing here.
Nah. I actually haven't heard that. I've only heard the original track list, yeah.
I downloaded it.
Oh, okay. That must be on, like, a later issue.
Well, it doesn't seem to be on the CD track listing, and I'm pretty sure what I downloaded had, like, an A and B, so I think it might be... There's also a German from 70... edition from 71, and it doesn't have the track list on this site. Let me check, hold on, let me check another website. Go on, sorry.
Yeah, well, I do like the funk songs. They're not. It's not innovative funk. Like I said, it's a bit middle of the road, but it's or it's very downstream of, once again, like Dance to the Music or Psychedelic Shack, the Temptations thing, right? But the sort of the more mellow, like breezier songs on this album, I find are like genuinely like genius in a weird way as far as pop goes. Like there's a song about, like, I think it's the second song or the third track where it's I want to like pay you back for loving me, and it's just like that great. I love that 70s like divorce music, you know, sort of sound. Like it's very like yearning, like sort of like lovelorn sort of sound. It's I find it's, when it's done so like interestingly, it's compelling. It's done for the most part in the 70s in a very like mundane way, right, and very typical and boring. Whereas when it's done well, like it really sort of pulls at the heartstrings. And then there's just like another song on here. It's called, like, you know, It's Time for a Love Uprising or something. That's what I mean as well by like the marrying of civil rights and like and hippiedom. It's just this idea of I remember once reading... Oh, nice. Okay.
Tracks.
Yeah,
like
okay.
a vinyl, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
CD.
There's just a few
So
extra.
I'm just showing the co-host, like, the version I downloaded, it lists the tracks in, like, A1 to 6 and B1 to 6.
There's,
so it's not like... It was a vinyl issue which had these other tracks on it.
There's 2 extra songs.
Yeah.
But the rest is... Yeah, the rest is the correct order. Yeah. Actually, I haven't heard that. Is the Grapevine version any good? Or?
It's real good, yeah.
Oh, cool. I gotta hear it then. Because, these guys, I first would have heard of them because of that Have You Seen Her song, but also an artist called Ruben Wilson did a cover of one of these guys' songs called Stoned Out of My Mind.
Okay.
It's a great song, or at least the Ruben Wilson version is amazing.
Okay.
The Charlotte's version is not as good. The Ruben Wilson version is really good. But, yeah, there's just, there's something about that Love Uprising song as well. It's just kind of... I remember once reading some critic apparently had a go at like Curtis Mayfield or like one of those sort of, for the like cheesiness of like the humanist like love hippiedom civil rights sentiment lyrics or whatever, or like marrying a, I think a critic had a go at the idea of the psychedelic shack or something like that. And then I think of all people, once again, Chris Gow was just like, oh, the Beatles sung about like walruses, what's wrong with that, like, you know. And I feel that way about, like, that Love Uprising song. In theory, it's such a cheesy idea for a song. So silly, like... But in a way, it's better than All You Need Is Love. Like, because it kicks in and he's just singing, like, if we put down our boxing gloves, you know? It's, like, a beautiful little... It's like pop at its purest, you know? Yeah, I was just sort of swept away by how good this is as a pop album. But it makes sense, because that Have You Seen Her song, like, when I first heard that, I was like, damn, how do you write a song like
that's
this?
fantastic. Yeah, I think that's the highlight of the album.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, that's the song I'd heard before listening to this and actually listening to it. It's fairly solid, very lush production. I felt the songs are okay, but I just felt they were a little bit stock, I'm not going to lie.
I said middle of the road.
Oh, yeah.
Like, that's what I mean.
Yeah,
like, it's... Yeah, well, that's... Of course, yeah.
Yeah, but fairly good. You know what I might, like, sooner bring up? We're talking about Psychedelic Soul. I've brought this album up on the show before. I'll just recommend it again. And speaking of a Marvin Gaye cover, the Albino Gorilla album, which came out in 1970, and it's called Detroit. Old title of Detroit 1984. It's considered a psychedelic soul release, but they have a lot of covers on there. Going to a Go-Go's on there, they have Grapevine on there as well, actually, but also Ain't No Mountain High Enough, and Psychedelic Shack's the last track.
Nice.
And like, but
those are classics.
Yeah, and like it's really, really smoothly produced, sort of slickly performed, extremely engaging, just like effortlessly likable album.
Yeah.
And it's almost like my go-to for these sort of releases.
Sure.
And so
well, the thing,
but no, something like this is still very much a good release. Don't get me wrong.
the thing I like about this genre is like a lot of it is like just middle of the road. Like it's not all like you mentioned, say Albino Gorilla or Isaac Hayes or something.
Those are great, yeah.
It's very like how would you describe something like Isaac Hayes? Like not Baroque, but Rococo or something, Whereas, like, just like heavy in a weird way.
Yeah, I would say Hot Buttered Soul feels a bit Baroque to me, but like some of the later,
Yeah.
Isaac Hayes gets a bit more Rococo, playful. Yeah, maybe.
But yeah, in the case of something like this or other, like I just find that, like something about this genre, it rides the line between middle of the road but interesting. Like something like the Isley Brothers as well. I guess where I get disconnected from this whole style is like Stevie Wonder.
Yeah,
I'm
like
like that.
overproduced and sort of corny. And
That's
sort
where
of
it
very
goes.
binary,
That's where it
sonically
feels like
and
there's
sort of, emotionally,
Even though this is trying to be a very populist album and sell lots of copies or whatever, I feel there's a sort of creativity like permutating out of it in a way
There's
that
an honesty to it. I was really
isn't-
impression that Stevie Wonder kind of wanted to be like.
that isn't in stuff like that, yeah, or like the Jackson 5 or
that was the father exploiting his children, obviously.
yeah, like a Beach Boys situation, yeah.
Yeah, exactly like that, actually. But yeah, a positive response from me, certainly.
No, I can see where
Yeah.
this music's certainly not for everyone. Like I picked something like
Well,
this.
it's very,
'cause-
very accessible. I don't know.
Yeah, well, at the time, definitely. I'm thinking more in the
People our age.
yeah, in the
I
present.
get our parents' generation would like it, obviously.
Probably, yeah. In the present day, it's just a fairly subjective pick from my end, but like you said, it is very enjoyable, or like it is just sort of example of like pure pop in a way.
Also, I guess we have to remember, in 1971, like, we didn't just have, like, little playlists to pull up from the internet. You literally just buy records, and if you wanted to just, like, have a nice, easygoing time or just wanted to relax at home, you just have these things as sort of your, like, chill-out mix playlists.
Yeah.
They're just these LPs, which, like, it didn't matter that they were stock. It just needed to be background music, effectively.
Yeah.
So I think we do often... We talk about that in the last Mandala to some extent, I remember, but like I think that point does need to be stressed. Obviously, that is when you think about sort of configure yourself into that time. That's kind of how you just get these albums. There are comp albums, but even albums from these artists, you see the cover and you're like, okay, yeah, I just want someone that sounds like this to chill out and smoke a cigar to or whatever.
Yeah.
Or like for when our neighbours are coming over for dinner, we need some stuff to pop on while we're like having a bit of wine afterward. Yeah, just something like that. You know what I mean?
Whereas,
just performing sort of a
like,
basic household function,
something like that,
like furniture music in its own way.
Whereas something like Understanding by Bobby Womack is like
That's more like deep
that's like
and sort
art
of
school.
emotional.
Like it's yeah.
Like one of those contemporary hip hop albums where they sort of just put all their emotions on this.
and that was like Bobby
sort of
Womack's
self-exploratory,
big.
confessional.
And that was his big hang up. Like I probably mentioned when I brought that album up. He has another album where there's a song where the record executives are like, "You're not commercial." Whereas something like this is the commercial soul that the record executives are trying to sell,
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think they're trying to subvert that whole industry by like, putting out this humanist message, I think it was legitimate from all these groups. Like they were pretty skeptical of their bosses, let's say.
Oh, yeah. Oh, one thing, have you seen a song? Awesome song. It
Oh,
reminded me
yeah,
a
it's
little bit of... There's a really fantastic song which I first heard via the Boondocks Season 2, and it's called Rock and Roll Gangsta by Arlon. And it's absolutely fantastic. It's
Okay.
really beautiful. It's one of those songs you describe.
Well, I've seen the Boondocks. I've
But
probably heard it.
like it just nails that
Okay.
sort of style that you were mentioning.
I gotta listen to
like
that.
beautiful middle of the road soul, but like the vocal track is phenomenal. It's really really gorgeous. It's from an album called Cream City, 1977.
Okay.
Arlon, it was an American soul group from LA.
What's
formed
the
by
cover look like?
Lead singer and guitarist Arlon Butler. I'll show you. So just go back one. That.
Okay. Cool.
Very,
That looks sick.
very colourful. But anyway, yeah, that's good stuff.
Nice.
Anything else to share about this one?
Nah, just if someone hasn't heard like psychedelic soul before, yeah, maybe don't start. Actually, start here, and then go listen to like the most acclaimed one or whatever. Go listen to Gil Scott Heron or
That's a good album.
Parliament or something like that. You know.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, have a taster and then jump in the deep end.
Yeah. And speaking of the deep end, I suppose we're going back to Japan here, and this is a group called. Now, it's difficult to pronounce. The act is called Korakyojin, and the album we're talking about today, just because what I wound up doing was I was looking through the 2000s list, and like there was a few things that appealed to me, but I was just like, I don't want things that are just like examples, like good examples of like this or that, or like sort of retro sort of thing. I want like the albums I picked were like reminiscent of genres that were around at the time, but like I guess I tended to maybe dismiss the sounds because of the groups that were more popular amongst it, but then there are like more interesting alternatives, like less well-known equivalents, you know, whether it's, you know, in the sort of more metal continuum or in the sort of you know, singer-songwriter world, or you know, dance punk sort of like, you know, mainstream like UK sort of hip new wave, or that sort of like what would be called melodic hardcore from around the turn of the millennium. But what we've got here is a music that I am more partial to. I'm more familiar with it as a 90s sound, and sure enough, this group did originate in the 90s, well, 1999. So what it is it's a live album, and so after looking through the 2000s, like, you know, best studio albums from REM, I decided to move on to the live albums, and I saw this in there, and I was like, hang on, it's a joint, let's go check this out. And I was not familiar with the group, and I looked at the group's page, and I was like, well, they got a lot of interesting looking stuff here, these covers that seem quite exciting and indicative of creative work within. And Isotope, this live album, really no exception. This kills. And it's the kind of band that, like, you wish that this could be the band that either you were a part of or that you were friends with, and you're like, oh yeah, I'm mates with this band. Like, this is the kind of, like, if you had mates who were in a band, or if I did, sorry, excuse me, this is the kind of music I'd be most excited if they were making. If they were like a rock group, like in the void of, like, say, electronic, you know, devices, if you know what I mean.
Sure, yeah.
Because I'm partial to electronic music in general. But in like a sort of, if I knew guys who were playing a rock band, especially in the contemporary, like what else can be done with the genre? Like playing sort of this musical, like Acid Mother's Temple-esque stuff, what the Japanese are doing, that's so compelling to me. I mean, if you do Squid, that's pretty cool too, to be fair. Like the equation, the sort of...
Like a Black Midi or
Maruja,
or like there's a few of those now, but like in the case of, what year is this album?
This is in 2005.
Yeah, nice. This is a bit of a sound from the time, though. Like, you know, I'm not too familiar with the sort of math rock of the early 2000s.
Well,
but stuff like, you know, Polvo or Lightning Bolt, or there's a band called Hella. They're a bit like this as well. But this is like one of the best examples of that sound I've ever heard.
Well, the reason why I associate it with being a 90s sound is because this was a sound in Japan in the 90s, but I associate it with a group called Ruins, probably the best exponent of this.
Okay, what's it called? What? The sound?
Oh, brutal prog.
Okay.
It's called math rock, but like it's kind of a scene, and I think Ruins were like sort of the big act of it, and they had their 95 album on my iTunes, which is called Hydero Mastroningham. It's pretty good.
No.
But remember, like Acid Mother's Temple, they formed in the 90s too. Oh, and their 2000 album, I also had. I like this one even more.
Yeah, that is a Japanese.
Called Parashtom. They're cool. And speaking of girl bands, Angel and Heavy Syrup, one of the great girl bands of all time, they're basically the lady version of Acid Mother's Temple. They're very good. But don't have as many albums to my memory. I think they've got like 4 or 5, but they were all good. I had them all on my iTunes, and they were really solid. Anyway, I just brought back a memory. I haven't thought about them for a while.
But yeah, the quick summary is this album is essentially an hour of the breakdowns in King Crimson and Mahu Vishnu orchestra songs. You know?
Yeah.
It's kind of awesome. Like, imagine that. Though, that's how it starts, but then it sort of progresses into strange, more like like very high density, like jazz fusion sort of stuff. Like later, like sort of middle parts of the album reminded me of like stretches of like Bruford, for example.
Yes.
And once again, the drumming's a bit similar. It's downstream of that sort of school.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's sort of, yeah, early on it's more in that like hyper abrasive, like frenetic math rock, you know. But then the guitars become a lot like fuzzier, and it goes more into that 70s sort of fusion territory in the middle part, right? And the weird part about this album was like, by the 45th minute or 50th minute or so, like, you know, by like, I'm not counting it out, but by like nearly an hour into it, like, this is one of those sort of journey things where like you get into the headspace of what it's trying to do. Like, it's like, obviously it's very technical. Like, maybe I'm not a musician, so I'm not appreciating it for the musicianship, though I can appreciate the musicianship.
Yeah.
But I'm sort of trying to get into the space of the album. And then by like the 45th or 50th minute, it's finally got me in like a hypnotic sort of daze. And in a way, like I'm walking around through the world, and it becomes a bit more colourful in the zany, like 90s cartoon sense, like Ren and Stimpy or something. It reminded me, or Duckman. It reminded me when I walked around once listening to a Grant Green album. And then after about like 45 or 50 minutes, like that wash happened as well. And it just happened to be as like I was like, I looked to the right of me, and there's just like because I'm in like a coastal suburb, like a fucking 45-year-old surfy guy trying to like skateboard waving down the middle of the street, and I'm just like, fuck, this is like a zany cartoon.
Reminds me of, there's a passage that Eric Davis once wrote about how when he was younger in like the late 80s in like San Fran or whatever, he swears he once had this weird thing where he walked into like a Robert Crumb cartoon, but like a live action version.
Yeah,
like
nice.
Everyone's so idiosyncratic and like vivid, and then he went into the coffee shop and there were all these characters, and it's just like, what's going on?
Another great example of that is the illustration, the Hunter S. Thompson guy. I forget his name, but you know the guy who illustrated for
Dr. Gonzo?
Oh,
No, sorry. Yeah.
He has a name, but
Yeah.
I forget what it is. But he's a great artist, and the picture he does of the Kentucky Derby is like that as well. Like, it's a great match.
Ralph Steadman?
Yeah, Ralph Steadman. Of that, like, sort of crumb, zany, like, yeah, sort of like proto-90s, like, grotesque cartoon.
British
sort of
guy,
stuff.
yeah, wow.
Yeah, he was English, yeah. But yeah, for somehow this album was sort of transformative in that sense. Like, once it finally works, it's... And then at least, like, the sort of... As well, outside of just that, the thing that made it come around to be at least a little more interesting was that, you know, you get into that space, but then, like, the third last song, or the second last song, like, suddenly becomes, like, rhythmic and melodic. And more of, like, you know, it's got a sort of melodic guitar bit, and you're like, oh wow, okay, so it brings you back into the world of like more like you know, just sort of smooth music or whatever.
Yeah.
Briefly gives you a taste of that, and then just sort of, you know, drones away to finish the album, you know. Sort of a good way to sequence a sort of album in the journey sense, especially one that's so technical and like heavy fusion like this, you know.
Yeah.
It's not just note density, it's actually doing something within that paradigm, you know.
Well, it's a little bit like that sort of cathartic punk release, isn't it? I think that's kind of what math rock was able to pull off.
Yeah, good point, yeah.
Well, and because what's interesting about this is a live album, because I can't
Is
imagine...
it live?
Yes, this is a live album.
Are you kidding
That's
me?
what I said, I found it in the live album section.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't hear that. That's nuts.
Yeah, I said that.
Live.
It's so that's the thing, like, because it's very well recorded. The speakers obviously... So the mic's obviously placed very well, and not in a way where the speakers can sort of feedback them too much, I guess. But what's beautiful about it is, I don't know if in a studio context they would have delivered something like this with this intensity or this like sort of intention where it's just rollicking, trying to like, you know, not like sort of like eschewing like extreme subtlety and just going for it with the audience, you know what I mean? And so you get this very singular sort of... It functions as a studio album, you didn't think twice about it.
Well, now that you mention it's got that live energy though.
That's the thing, and that's what's so beautiful about it. Like, that's what I love. Like, I mean, I'm sure this group studio stuff is really, really cool, but like, I feel like it's one of those contexts where like a live album is so interesting that it may as well be like a studio release. Obviously, maybe there are tracks being played here that are from some of these albums. They only had 2 albums before this one. and so you have to wonder, like, are these original jams or not? You know.
Yeah.
I'm not certain. But so it just functions in an interesting place where, like, sometimes, you know, a live album can be just like, you know, greatest hits performed in front of a crowd or whatever, or not. Sometimes there's studio trickery. But this is a case where studio album this live album may as well be a studio album seemingly. It's just like a fantastic sort of esoteric, sort of creepy, sort of like trip album in like sort of a 90s whack electronic EMT sense, but with like the totally different genre being performed, if you know what I mean. Like it's from that sort of out there, like proggy sort of like extreme math fusion world, but has the it's one of these albums that like takes you to a different place, and that if you were tripping, you would like, you know, you would put this on to take you to like a very bizarre, fanciful place. Normally you might put on, you know, like I said, EMT records, or how about that Gandalf album that we talked about on Mandala, or any of his albums in general, but that's the one we discussed on the show, so there's more reference you've heard at least.
Those ones are a lot easier in the palette, whereas this is a bit more like you know.
And isn't it fascinating that something that's so harsh can take you there?
Well, like I mentioned, the breakdowns of King Crimson's songs. You know that infamous quote where what was it?
To be fair, a lot of the prog albums could take you to that place at the best of times.
Was it Bruford who said that like King Crimson is like a dark place,
very terrifying place?
Yeah, that's how I would describe this album. Is a very terrifying place. You know. In the best possible sense.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
It's the Kentucky Derby or the Crumb Drawing or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, it's but once you sort of accept that and let it wash over you, I suppose it is sort of contemporaneous and Y2K apocalyptic in that sort of sense as well. It's definitely music you wouldn't have gotten in the 20th century. You know, it just taking things
often.
just like taking jazz and like, you know, the excesses of like post rock and you know, math sort of music to its like fullest extremes, you know, and managing to mix like technicality and creativity once again in such a sort of natural way.
Yeah, I think a lot of the fusion and all the math can get like caught up and sort of distracted by being so technical that it doesn't really take you anywhere. It's just noodling. You're just focusing on the note density.
Yeah, exactly.
Where it's like this actually composes a world with all of that stuff, you know, in the way that like the electronic music does. You know what I mean?
Yeah, very well. Yeah,
I think that was Prog's problem sometimes. Is like sometimes the electronic soundscapes of like later artists in the 80s and 90s, or like Tangerine Dream, more contemporary to acts like King Crimson, Genesis, or Yes, or ELP. Like you could sooner get the Kraftwerk electronic releases sooner took you to outer space, or Brian Eno's early electronic experiments, they sooner took you to outer space than even Tales from Topographic Oceans or Lark's Tongues in Aztec. I mean, that's a very good album, to be fair.
Well,
or Pink Floyd, or
to be fair, I think it was
Surgery, you know.
The last song, once again, to compare this album to King Crimson,
went
into a riff sort of, you know, more basic to the structures of what's on this album, and it literally was very similar to the Lark's Tongue Part 2, you know. This was very, very drawn from that world of also prog metal.
Of course.
Like, in a way, this album wore its sort of influences on its sleeves, but it also transcended its influences.
I think so
though.
too, yeah.
You know,
you know that a lot of neo-prog, I mean, this is brutal prog rather than neo-prog, I guess, but yeah, a lot of the neo-prog I've heard really fails to do. Dream Theater is pretty good sometimes, but it's also just like, I don't know, trying to occupy where Rush couldn't be because they were too old / you know, they were kind of hemisphered out, if you will. According to Rush.
Hemisphered out, yeah.
Well, so after Hemispheres, they didn't really want to do an album like that again because it was so arduous.
Yeah, and Hemispheres feels like a bit like, you know, when you hear how the members, Bruford, once again, described the process of Yes, where they're just being, like, annoyingly particular in a way when it comes to songwriting, and you lose a bit of immediacy out of that, at least, you know.
Yeah.
It's not a terrifying place, it's actually dull and boring in a way, you know. Whereas this is not dull and boring.
Not at all.
For, like, music that is typically, like, I like Maru Vishnu Orchestra, though.
I like them a lot, yeah.
I can see where people who are, like, I don't know, just, like, hard rock purists or just, like, pop music purists being like, that's not even music, you know.
Mm.
Because I can see where people come from with things like John Coltrane and stuff like that as well, you know. They probably don't think of that as music.
Like
And-
the more extreme, like later Coltrane, like Rashid
Yeah.
Ali Coltrane.
I'm thinking, or Ascension, or, you know, just...
Yeah, where when Alice was the pianist instead of McCoy Tyner.
Yeah, when he's not doing bop, you know, when he's doing... But you get what I mean.
Spiritual
Like,
jazz.
people who are just sort of more populist in their music taste don't even consider stuff like that music, or this. But, like, I really, you know, that's the case where that's sort of, like, populist elitism, you know.
Oh, I agree. Yeah.
Because, like, something like this is not Emperor's New Clothes, you know. It's not, like, noodling or just, like, you know, art students or, like, jazz, like, larpers or something. It's like, really, just as, like you said, punk rock, at the heart of, like, spontaneous music in a way. It's funny that you do, now that you mention it's a live album as opposed to a studio, the one thing I did notice was it got really quiet twice or 3 times, and then it came back again, so I guess that was the live thing.
You know, we can also compare it to like the hardcore EDM, I think, in its own way. In terms of the effect it has, you know what I mean? Like it's very...
Sure!
Like it's very sort of... like it's all this... punk rock was a bit primeval, whereas this is a bit more like of a futurist rush, you know what I mean? I don't know if I'm making sense.
No, that's true. It's a bit more like Dada in that sense, whereas like punk rock is a bit more literal. It's less mashed or whatever. I get where you're coming from there. Like something like 2010s, like Footwork Jungle, is more like this. You know, these like hyper repetitive loops and then like abrupt changes, done subtly and shit like that. You know.
Yeah, I think that's.
It's a good comparison. It's an interesting album, for sure.
Worth
the time as a sort of experience listen. It's not like an everyday listen, you know. It's like a Blue Moon album,
you don't trip every day, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Kara Kyojin, we endorse them here. Like more of their stuff. Hopefully, I'll want to discuss more of it on the channel one day, even. On Mandala, obviously, depending on how it goes, because it looks like...
Do they have many albums? Or?
They have 7 studio albums from 1999 to 2021.
Okay.
They seem very interesting.
Yeah, nice.
But yeah, that's all interesting I've got to share about these Kara Kyojin Isotope 2005.
Yeah,
I suppose.
It's about time you all wise up.
Uh-huh.
You should wise up and see that these are petrified giants.
And on that note, I suppose, unless there's anything else of interest to share...
Wrap it up, I suppose.
Alright, thank you everyone. That's been just over 2.5 hours. Appreciate your time. If you've spent it here, have the best possible day, night you could possibly imagine. Appreciate it.